They called her a murderer, a poison-wielding widow who'd ended her own husband's life for power and gold. And tonight, as Lysandra Vale knelt in the mud before the Grand Council, wrists bound in iron and tears streaming down her porcelain cheeks, the man she'd trusted most, Darian Ashford, stood above her with righteous fury blazing in his eyes, demanding her execution. But what no one in that marble hall knew was that the truth buried beneath their judgment would one day return with the force of a winter storm, carried by a king who'd learned to see past lies. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city name in the comments below. And if you want to see how a broken noblewoman becomes the force that brings a kingdom to its knees, stay until the very end. Hit that like button, and let's begin this journey together. The morning Rowan died, the sky had been the color of old bruises. Lysandra remembered that detail with painful clarity, how the clouds had hung low and swollen over Vale Manor, how the air had tasted of coming rain and something else, something bitter she couldn't name. She'd woken to find her husband's side of the bed cold, his breathing shallow and wrong, his lips tinged with an unnatural blue. "Rowan?" Her voice had cracked with sleep and confusion. "Rowan, what's wrong?" His eyes had opened, those warm brown eyes that had looked at her with such devotion on their wedding day 3 years prior, and for a moment they'd focused on her face. His lips had moved, forming words that never came, and then his hand had reached for hers with desperate urgency. "Lysandra, That was all. His fingers had gone slack in her grasp, his chest had stilled, and the man she loved more than her own breath had simply stopped. The scream that tore from her throat had brought the entire household running. Servants had flooded into the chamber, their faces white with shock. The house physician, old Dr. Merrick, had pushed through the crowd, his gnarled hands immediately seeking a pulse that no longer existed. "He's gone, my lady," Merrick had whispered, his voice hollow. "Lord Rowan is gone." No. Lysandra had clutched her husband's cooling body to her chest, her silk nightgown soaking up the cold sweat on his skin. "No, he was fine last night. We had dinner together, we laughed, This doesn't make sense." But nothing about that terrible morning had made sense. Not the way Rowan's body had already begun to stiffen, not the strange, almost sweet smell that clung to his lips, not the way Darian Ashford, Rowan's closest friend since childhood, the man who'd stood as best man at their wedding, had appeared in the doorway with eyes that held something darker than grief. What happened? Darian's voice had been quiet, controlled, but beneath it ran a current of something Lysandra couldn't identify. "I don't know." She'd looked up at him with desperate, pleading eyes. "He was fine, Darian. Last night he was perfectly fine." Darian had moved closer, his gaze sweeping over the scene with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He'd bent down, studying Rowan's face, his lips, the way his fingers had curled into claws. When he'd straightened, his expression had been unreadable. "Dr. Merrick," he'd said softly, "what could cause such a sudden death?" The old physician had wrung his hands, his watery eyes darting between Lysandra and Darian. There are several possibilities, Lord Ashford. Heart failure, apoplexy, perhaps, or poison." The word had fallen into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through every person present. Lysandra's head had snapped up, her vision blurring with tears. "What?" Darian's face had remained carefully neutral, but his eyes, those pale gray eyes she'd always found cold, had fixed on her with laser focus. "Forgive me, Lady Vale, but we must consider all possibilities. Your husband was a young man, healthy and strong. Such sudden death is unusual. You can't possibly think—" She'd risen to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. "Darian, you know me. You know I would never— I know that Lord Rowan changed his will 3 days ago." Darian's voice had cut through her protest like a blade. "I know that he made you sole heir to the Vale fortune and estates. I know that you now stand to inherit one of the largest fortunes in the kingdom." The heir had left the room. Every servant, every guard, every member of the household had turned to stare at her with newly suspicious eyes. Lysandra had felt the world tilting beneath her feet. I didn't even know about the will." Her voice had risen, hysteria creeping in at the edges. "Rowan never told me." "Convenient." The word had been barely a whisper, but it had carried. Dr. Merrick had cleared his throat, his hands still trembling. Lord Ashford, perhaps we should wait for a proper examination before we make such serious accusations. By all means, examine him. Darian had stepped back, his arms crossing over his chest. But I think we'll find that Lord Rowan Vale died of poisoning, and I think we'll find that the poison was administered by the one person with both access and motive. Lysandra's world had shattered in that moment, not from the accusation, though that had been horrific enough, but from the certainty in Darian's voice, the cold calculation, the way he'd looked at her, not with the shock and grief of a friend, but with the satisfied precision of a hunter closing a trap. "You can't do this," she'd whispered. "Darian, please. You've known me for years. You stood at our wedding. I stood at your wedding and watched you ensnare my best friend with your beauty and your manipulation." His mask had slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and terrible beneath. "I watched him change, become weak, put you above his duty, his family, his very name, and now he's dead, and you're rich. That's insane. I loved him." "Love?" Darian had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You loved his title, you loved his money, and when you'd secured both, you disposed of the man himself." The physician had backed away, fear playing on his weathered face. The servants had begun to murmur, their whispers building like a rising tide. Lysandra had seen it then, the trap closing, the noose tightening. Darian hadn't just accused her, he'd already convinced them. "I want her confined to her chambers," Darian had announced, his voice ringing with authority that wasn't his to claim. "Post guards at her door. Let no one in or out until the Grand Council can be convened." "You have no authority here." Lysandra had spun to face the household guard, desperation making her voice sharp. "I am lady of this house. I am your mistress." But the guards had already been moving, their faces hard with suspicion and judgment. Strong hands had grasped her arms, and she'd fought, screaming Rowan's name, screaming her innocence, screaming until her throat went raw. They dragged her from the death chamber where her husband's body still lay cooling, hauled her through corridors she'd walked as their lady, past servants who'd once smiled and curtsied and now watched with horror and disgust. They'd thrown her into her private chambers, the rooms she'd decorated with such care, filled with gifts from Rowan, memories of their brief, bright happiness, and locked the door with a finality that echoed through her bones. Lysandra had collapsed against the wood, her silk nightgown stained with Rowan's sweat and her own tears, and for the first time since childhood, she'd felt truly, utterly alone. The days that followed had blurred into a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. They'd kept her locked in those chambers for a week while Dr. Merrick conducted his examination. A week of pacing the same floors, staring at the same walls, picking at food that tasted like ash, and sleeping in fitful bursts haunted by Rowan's blue-tinged lips and Darian's cold, triumphant eyes. The maids who'd once chattered and laughed as they dressed her now entered in silence, their movements quick and fearful, as if proximity to her might somehow taint them. They wouldn't meet her eyes, wouldn't answer her questions. The younger one, sweet Martha, who'd been so excited when Lysandra had given her a silk ribbon for her birthday, had actually flinched when their hands accidentally touched. "Please," Lysandra had whispered, grasping the girl's wrist. "Please, Martha, you know me. You know I would never hurt Lord Rowan. He was everything to me." Martha's eyes had filled with tears, but she'd pulled away, shaking her head. "They found the poison, my lady," she'd breathed. "They found it in your vanity drawer, hidden beneath your brushes. They found it, and Lord Ashford says you used it to kill your husband for his gold." The room had spun. "That's impossible. I've never, someone put it there. Don't you see? Someone is framing me." But Martha had already fled, her sobs echoing down the hallway. That night, alone in the dark, Lysandra had torn through her vanity like a woman possessed. And there, beneath the silver brushes Rowan had given her as a wedding gift, she'd found it. A small crystal vial filled with clear liquid, stoppered with wax. Her hands had trembled as she'd held it up to the moonlight. Someone had planted it. Someone had murdered her husband and planted the evidence in her own room. And she knew with sick certainty that made her stomach heave, that when she tried to claim it was planted, no one would believe her. They'd already decided she was guilty. The evidence just made it official. The Grand Council had convened on the 7th day. They dragged her from Vale Manor in chains, actual iron chains that bit into her wrists and ankles, that marked her as criminal before the trial had even begun. The citizens of Vale City had lined the streets to watch her pass, and their faces had held none of the warmth she'd known. Instead, she'd seen rage, betrayal, disgust. Murderer, poison witch! She killed him for gold! Someone had thrown rotten fruit. It had splattered across her cheek, and the guards hadn't stopped to clean it. They'd wanted her to arrive at the council chambers marked dirtied, less than human. The Grand Council met in an ancient hall of white marble and soaring columns, a place built to inspire awe and fear in equal measure. Lysandra had been made to kneel in the center of that vast space, her chains anchored to iron rings set into the floor. Around her, in a perfect circle, the 12 council members had sat in raised seats, looking down on her like gods judging a mortal. And standing before them all, dressed in black as if he were chief mourner, had been Darian Ashford. "My lords and ladies of the council," he'd begun, his voice steady and mournful, "we gather today to seek justice for a terrible crime. Lord Rowan Vale, my dearest friend, a man beloved by all who knew him, has been murdered, poisoned in his own bed by the woman he trusted most." Lysandra had tried to speak, but one of the guards had struck her across the back, driving the breath from her lungs. "You'll have your chance," the head councilman had said coldly. "Lord Ashford has the floor." And Darian had used it masterfully. He'd painted a picture of her as a calculating seductress who'd set her sights on the Vale fortune from the moment they'd met. He'd twisted every kindness Rowan had shown her into evidence of manipulation. Every gift became proof of greed. Every tender moment between husband and wife became part of her elaborate scheme. "I tried to warn him," Darian had said, and actual tears had gleamed in his eyes. Crocodile tears, Lysandra had thought with bitter fury. "I told Rowan that she was too interested in his wealth, too quick to encourage him to distance himself from his family and advisors. But he was besotted, blind. He trusted her absolutely." "That's not true." The words had burst from Lysandra before she could stop them. "Rowan made his own choices. He distanced himself from you because you were cruel and controlling, because you treated him like a possession instead of a person." The council had stirred, murmuring amongst themselves. Darian's face had gone hard. "As you can see, my lords, she maintains her manipulation even now, but the evidence speaks louder than her protestations." He gestured, and a servant had brought forward the crystal vial. "This poison was found in Lady Vale's private chambers. Dr. Merrick's examination confirmed that Lord Rowan died of the same poison contained in this vial." "It was planted!" Lysandra had lurched against her chains, desperation making her voice crack. "Someone put it there to frame me, can't you see? I had no reason to kill my husband. I loved him." "You loved his money," Darian had corrected softly. "And now you have it, along with his lands, his title, everything he possessed. Quite the reward for a little crystal vial and a poisoned wine cup." There was no poisoned wine. Rowan drank from the same bottle I did at dinner." "Did he?" Darian had tilted his head. "The servants remember you pouring his wine that night. They remember you insisting he drink it all, that you'd chosen it specially for him." How touching, how deadly. It had been a lie, a complete fabrication. But when Lysandra had looked at the council members' faces, she'd seen them believing it. They'd wanted to believe it. A beautiful woman betraying her husband for gold was a story they understood, a narrative that fit their worldview. The trial had lasted 3 days. 3 days of accusation and false testimony. 3 days of watching people she'd considered friends, or at least friendly, stand before the council and repeat stories Darian had clearly fed them. The head steward claiming she'd asked questions about poisons months ago, she hadn't. The stable master saying she'd seemed cold to Rowan in his final weeks, she'd loved him more each day. Even old Dr. Merrick, his hands shaking and his eyes unable to meet hers, confirming that the poison found in her room matched the poison in Rowan's body, but never mentioning that anyone could have planted it there. Darian had orchestrated it all with the precision of a master puppeteer, and Lysandra, bound and silenced at every turn, had been powerless to stop it. On the 3rd day, they'd allowed her to speak in her own defense. She'd stood, chains clanking, body trembling with exhaustion and fear, and told them the truth. She'd described her love for Rowan in words that came straight from her shattered heart, She'd explained how happy they'd been, how he'd told her just the night before he died that she was his greatest blessing, how she'd had everything she'd ever wanted and no reason at all, to take it away. "If I'd wanted his money," she'd said, her voice breaking, "I already had it. He gave me everything freely. Why would I risk it all, risk my own life to murder the man I loved? It makes no sense." But Darian had been ready for that too. "Because Lord Rowan had discovered your affair," he'd said quietly, and the room had erupted. "What?" Lysandra had stared at him in absolute shock. "That's insane. There was never anyone but Rowan." "Lord Rowan's personal guard saw you in the garden 3 nights before his death, in the arms of another man. He saw you kissing him. He reported it to his lord, and Lord Rowan confronted you. You killed him before he could change his will back and cast you out with nothing." The lie had been so enormous, so utterly without foundation, that Lysandra had actually laughed, a desperate, broken sound that had made the council members lean back in their seats. "Bring forward this guard," she'd demanded. "Let him testify to my face." "Sadly, the guard died 2 days ago," Darian had said smoothly. "A terrible accident with his horse. But he'd already given his statement to me, witnessed and sealed." Of course he had. The guard had probably never existed, or if he had, Darian had silenced him permanently. The trap was perfect, seamless, impossible to escape. The verdict had been unanimous. Lysandra Vale, the head councilman, had intoned, his face carved from stone, "This council finds you guilty of the murder of your husband, Lord Rowan Vale, through the administration of poison with malicious intent. The penalty for such a crime is death." Her heart had stopped. Around her, the great hall had erupted in shouts of approval, of righteous fury. They'd wanted her blood. But Darian had raised his hand, his expression sorrowful and magnanimous. "My lords," he'd said, "if I may." Lord Rowan was a merciful man, slow to anger and quick to forgive. In his memory, I would ask the council to show similar mercy. Let her live, but let her live with the consequences of her actions. Strip her of her title, her lands, her fortune. Brand her a murderess and cast her beyond our borders. Let her survive in the wilderness if she can, and if she cannot, well, that will be justice of a different kind. The council had deliberated for less than 10 minutes. They'd stripped her of everything. Her title had been revoked, her inheritance seized, the Vale lands and fortune divided among Rowan's distant relatives, with Darian, as executor, controlling it all until proper heirs could be established. They'd taken her jewelry, her clothes, even her wedding ring. They'd given her a rough peasant dress and a pair of worn boots, and that was all. And then they'd branded her. She'd screamed as the hot iron pressed into her left shoulder, a mark that would identify her forever as a convicted murderer, a warning to anyone who might show her kindness. The smell of her own burning flesh had filled her nostrils, and she'd vomited onto the marble floor while the guards laughed. "Let her go," the head councilman had announced. "Drive her to the northern border and release her beyond the frontier. If she survives the wilderness, so be it. If not, let the beasts have her. Either way, justice is served." They'd put her on a wagon that night, still in chains, still marked with the brand that burned like hellfire beneath her rough dress. The journey north had taken 4 days, 4 days of hard travel through increasingly wild country, past villages and farmland, and finally into the deep forest that marked the edge of civilized territory. On the 4th night, they'd stopped at the very edge of the frontier woods. "This is as far as we go," the captain of the guard had said. He'd been one of Rowan's men once, had smiled at Lysandra when she'd walked the halls of Vale Manor. Now his face was hard, unforgiving. Beyond those trees is wilderness, wolves, bears, bandits, and worse. No law, no shelter, no mercy. "Please." She'd looked up at him with desperate eyes. "Please, I'm innocent. Darian Ashford killed my husband and framed me for it. You have to believe me. You have to save your lies for the wolves, murderess." He'd unlocked her chains, and rough hands had shoved her from the wagon. She'd fallen hard, her palms scraping against stones and dead leaves. When she'd pushed herself up, the wagon was already turning around. The guards hadn't looked back. Within minutes, the sound of hooves had faded, and Lysandra had been utterly, completely alone. She'd knelt there in the dirt as darkness fell around her, as the first cold stars emerged overhead, as the forest began to wake with sounds both familiar and terrifying. And for the first time since that terrible morning when Rowan had died in her arms, she'd let herself truly break. She'd sobbed until her throat was raw, until her body shook with the force of it, until there were no more tears left to cry. She'd screamed her innocence to the uncaring trees, cursed Darian's name to the indifferent sky, begged Rowan's spirit for some sign, some guidance, some reason to keep breathing. But the forest had given her only silence. As the moon rose, painting the world in shades of silver and shadow, Lysandra had forced herself to stand. Her brand still throbbed with pain. Her stomach was empty. They'd given her no food for the journey. Her dress was little more than rags. She had no weapon, no shelter, no idea how to survive in the wilderness. But she was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was still alive. And if she was alive, there was still a chance to prove her innocence, a chance to find evidence that would expose Darian's crimes, a chance, however slim, to reclaim her name and honor Rowan's memory. First, though, she had to survive the night. Lysandra had turned her back on civilization, on the kingdom that had betrayed her, the system that had failed her, the man who'd destroyed her life, and walked into the frontier woods. The trees had swallowed her whole, and the darkness had been complete. Behind her, the last lights of the kingdom had flickered and died. Ahead, there was only wilderness, danger, and the terrible uncertainty of what came next. But Lysandra Vale, branded murderess, exiled noblewoman, broken widow, had taken that first step forward, and then another, and another. She had no way of knowing that this walk into darkness would eventually lead to light, that the woman who entered those woods powerless and alone would emerge transformed, carrying with her a truth powerful enough to bring an entire kingdom to its knees. All she knew was that she refused to die. Not here. Not like this. Not before Darian Ashford paid for what he'd done. The wilderness had claimed many before her, nobles and commoners alike, swallowed by the unforgiving frontier and never seen again. But Lysandra Vale would not be one of them. She would survive. She would endure. And one day, somehow, she would return. The forest seemed to sense her determination. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, a lonely, haunting sound that should have terrified her. Instead, Lysandra had lifted her chin, her jaw set with grim resolve. If the wolves wanted her, they'd have to catch her first, and she had no intention of being caught. The first night nearly killed her. Lysandra had walked until her legs gave out, stumbling through underbrush that tore at her thin dress and scratched her exposed arms. When she'd finally collapsed against a massive oak, her breathing ragged and her feet bleeding through her worn boots, the temperature had already begun to drop. Spring might have arrived in the valleys and cities, but here in the deep frontier woods, winter still held sway after dark. She'd had nothing. No flint for fire, no blanket, no food. The rough peasant dress they'd given her might as well have been made of paper for all the warmth it provided. As the cold seeped into her bones, making her teeth chatter, and her fingers go numb, Lysandra had understood with crystalline clarity that this was how they'd expected her to die. Not torn apart by wolves, though that might come later, but simply frozen in the dark like a discarded thing. The thought had filled her with such fierce rage that she'd forced herself to move. If they wanted her dead, she'd refuse them the satisfaction. She'd gathered what dry leaves and twigs she could find in the darkness, her numb fingers fumbling and clumsy. Without flint, she couldn't make fire, but she could make a nest, a barrier between her body and the frozen ground. She'd burrowed into the pile like an animal, pulling leaves over herself until she was buried, and then she'd curled as tight as possible, trying to conserve what little warmth her body still generated. The night had been endless. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body shaking so violently that her muscles cramped and seized. Wolves had howled in the distance, closer than she would have liked. And once, something large had passed near her hiding spot, its breathing heavy and purposeful. She'd frozen, not even daring to breathe, until it moved on. When dawn had finally broken, gray and cold, Lysandra had emerged from her leaf nest like something crawling from a grave. Every muscle screamed. Her brand felt infected, hot, and swollen beneath her dress. Her empty stomach had cramped with hunger so intense it made her vision swim. But she was alive. Day 1, she'd whispered to herself, her voice hoarse and strange. You survived day one. The days that followed had blurred into a nightmare of survival that stripped away everything she'd once been. Lady Lysandra Vale, who'd been taught to walk with grace, to speak with eloquence, to manage a great household with skill and poise, ceased to exist. In her place emerged something rawer, something that ran on instinct and desperation rather than training and propriety. She'd learned to find water by following animal tracks to streams. She'd learned which berries could be eaten and which would make her violently ill, a lesson purchased at the cost of 12 hours spent vomiting behind a rotting log. She'd learned to identify edible roots and fungi, to crack open fallen logs in search of grubs that made her gag but kept her alive. The hunger had been the worst part, a gnawing, constant companion that made her hands shake and her mind drift. She'd fantasized about the meals she'd taken for granted at Vale Manor: roasted pheasant with herb butter, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, honeyed wine, and sweet pastries. The memories had been torture, so she'd forced herself to stop thinking about them, to focus only on the next mouthful of whatever sustenance she could find. 3 weeks into her exile, she'd caught her first fish. It had been an accident, really. She'd been trying to grab stones from a stream to use as potential weapons when her hand had closed around something slippery and thrashing. She'd yanked it out of the water on pure reflex, and there it had been. A trout, maybe a foot long, flopping on the bank. She'd stared at it for a frozen moment, watching it gasp and struggle, and something inside her had broken and reformed simultaneously. This was meat, real protein, something that could keep her alive for days if she could just figure out how to... Her hands had moved without conscious thought. She'd grabbed a rock and brought it down on the fish's head again and again until it stopped moving. Her first kill. Her hands had been shaking so badly she'd almost dropped her prize. Starting a fire had taken another 2 days to figure out. She'd tried everything, rubbing sticks together until her palms blistered and bled, striking stones in every combination she could think of, even attempting to use a piece of broken glass she'd found to focus sunlight. Nothing had worked until she'd discovered a method in the remains of an old campsite, where someone, a hunter maybe, or another exile, had left behind a fire bow. She'd studied the device, tried to replicate its motion, failed a dozen times, and then... smoke. Blessed, beautiful smoke, followed by a tiny ember that she'd nursed into flame with breath and prayers and shaking hands. When the fish had cooked, the smell had been so overwhelming that she'd wept. And when she'd taken that first bite, the hot, flaky meat filling her mouth, she'd understood why people said that hunger was the best seasoning. Nothing in her privileged life had ever tasted so good. But survival wasn't just about food and fire. The wilderness held dangers that went beyond simple starvation. A month into her exile, she'd encountered her first human. She'd been checking a primitive snare she'd constructed, more hope than engineering, when the sound of voices had frozen her in place. Male voices, rough and loud, coming from the direction of her camp. Her heart had hammered against her ribs as she'd crept closer, using the trees for cover. There had been 3 of them. Frontier bandits, by the look of them, dirty, armed with crude weapons, their clothes a patchwork of stolen goods. They'd been rifling through her meager possessions, laughing at the poverty of her camp. Told you there was someone out here, one had said, a tall man with a scar bisecting his face. Saw smoke last night. Not much to steal. Another had kicked at her carefully arranged pile of firewood. Maybe whoever it is has something better hidden. Or maybe they're worth more than their possessions. The third man, shorter but broader, with hands like slabs of meat, had grinned. Could be a runaway. Could be worth a bounty. Lysandra's blood had turned to ice. If they caught her, if they saw her brand, they'd know exactly what she was. At best, they'd turn her in for whatever reward might be offered. At worst, she'd started to back away, moving as silently as she'd learned to move, when her foot had come down on a dry branch. The crack had echoed like a gunshot. "There!" Scarface had whirled, his hand going to the knife at his belt. "In the trees!" She'd run. The forest had become a blur of green and brown as she'd crashed through underbrush, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart trying to hammer out of her chest. Behind her, the men had given chase, their shouts and curses spurring her forward. "Just want to talk," one had called, but his laughter had said otherwise. Lysandra had known these woods now, knew their rhythms and hiding places. She ducked behind a massive fallen log, then immediately changed direction, heading for the stream she'd been fishing in earlier. The water would hide her scent if they had dogs, and the stones would leave no tracks. She'd splashed into the current, gasping at the cold, and followed it downstream for what felt like miles. Her legs had burned, her lungs had screamed, but she hadn't stopped until she'd found a hollow beneath an overhang where the roots of a great tree had created a natural cave. She'd crawled inside and waited, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear, as the sounds of pursuit had gradually faded. They'd searched for hours. She'd heard them calling to each other, their frustration mounting as the trail went cold. But eventually, as the sun had begun to set, they'd given up. "Probably just a deer," Scarface had grumbled, his voice carrying across the water. "Waste of time." "Should torch this camp anyway," the broad one had suggested. "Let 'em know this territory's spoken for." And they had. Lysandra had watched from her hiding place as smoke had risen from the direction of her campsite, destroying the shelter she'd so carefully constructed, the supplies she'd so painfully gathered. Weeks of work, gone in minutes. When they'd finally left and full darkness had fallen, she'd emerged from the hollow like a ghost. Her body had shaken with more than cold as she'd made her way back to her camp. They'd destroyed everything. Her firebow, her snares, her carefully dried fish, the extra firewood she'd stockpiled. Even the rough sleeping mat she'd woven from grass had been kicked apart and scattered. Only the ashes of her fire remained, still smoking in the growing dark. Lysandra had stood in the ruins of her survival and felt something fundamental shift inside her. She'd lost her title, her home, her husband, her name. She'd been cast into the wilderness to die. She'd nearly frozen, nearly starved, nearly been caught by men who would have done things she didn't want to imagine. And still, impossibly, she was alive. "You want me dead?" she'd whispered to the smoke-stained sky, to the kingdom that had exiled her, to Darian's ghost that haunted her every waking moment. "Then you'll have to do better than this." She'd rebuilt, started over, built a new shelter farther from any trails, deeper in the woods where casual bandits wouldn't venture. She'd made new snares, found new fishing spots, learned to move through the forest like a shadow. The weeks had turned to months. Summer had arrived, making survival easier but bringing new challenges. Insects that bit and swarmed, sudden violent storms that could destroy her shelter in minutes, the constant threat of larger predators driven to boldness by the season. She'd seen bears, wolves, wild boars with tusks like daggers. She'd learned to avoid them, to read the signs of their presence and give them wide berth. Once she'd climbed a tree and stayed there for an entire day while a mother bear and her cubs had fed on berries below, their massive bodies a reminder of how fragile her existence truly was. But it was the solitude that had nearly broken her. Humans were not meant to be alone. Lysandra had always known that intellectually, but experiencing it was different. The silence pressed in, day after day, until she'd started talking to herself just to hear a voice. She'd named the birds that visited her camp: Scarlet for the cardinal, Shadow for the crow, Melody for the thrush. She'd told them about Rowan, about Vale Manor, about the life she'd lost. Sometimes she'd wondered if she was going mad. Then, on a night when the summer storms rolled in with fury and violence, she'd found someone else. The rain had been torrential, the kind that turned the forest floor to mud, and the streams to raging torrents. Lysandra had been huddled in her shelter, better built now, with a proper roof of woven branches and moss, listening to the thunder shake the earth when she'd heard something that didn't belong. A cry. Human. Weak but desperate. She'd frozen, every instinct screaming at her to stay hidden. The bandits had taught her that other humans were dangerous, unpredictable. But the cry had come again, and beneath the fear, Lysandra had heard pain. Someone was hurt, badly. "Stay here," she'd told herself. "It's not your problem. It could be a trap." But her hands had already been moving, gathering her makeshift knife, a sharpened stone bound to a stick, and the dried grass she used for starting fires. Before she could talk herself out of it, she ducked out into the storm. The rain had been blinding, cold despite the summer heat, driven horizontal by wind that tore at the trees. Lysandra had followed the sound of those cries, her feet slipping in mud, branches whipping at her face. Lightning had illuminated the forest in stark flashes, turning it into something alien and terrifying. She'd found the woman at the bottom of a ravine, half submerged in water that was rising fast. Even in the darkness and rain, Lysandra had been able to see that she was older, her hair silver and matted with blood, her clothes, once fine but now torn and muddy, marking her as someone of quality. A merchant's wife, maybe, or minor nobility. Someone who had no business being in the frontier woods. "Help me!" The woman's voice had been barely audible over the storm. "Please, can't... my leg..." Lysandra had slid down the muddy slope, her heart pounding. Up close, she'd been able to see the problem. A fallen tree had the woman pinned, its weight crushing her leg at an unnatural angle. The water was rising, already up to the woman's waist. In minutes, she'd drown. "I'm going to get you out," Lysandra had said, the words leaving her mouth before she'd fully thought them through. "Hold on." The tree had been massive, waterlogged, impossibly heavy. Lysandra had braced her feet in the mud and pushed with everything she had. It hadn't budged. "Leave me," the woman had gasped. "You can't... save yourself." "No." Lysandra's voice had been fierce. She'd lost too much, buried too many people. She would not lose another. "I didn't survive 3 months in this hell just to watch someone drown." She'd looked around desperately, rain streaming down her face, and spotted a thick branch that had fallen nearby. A lever. She could use it as a lever. Working with frantic speed, she'd wedged the branch under the tree and found a rock to use as a fulcrum. Her hands had slipped on the wet wood, her muscles had screamed in protest, but she'd thrown all her weight onto the makeshift lever. The tree had shifted, just an inch, but it had been enough. "Pull yourself out," Lysandra had shouted. "Now!" The woman had tried, her face contorting with agony, but her crushed leg wouldn't cooperate. The water had been rising, already at her chest. Lysandra had made a decision that would haunt her for days afterward. She'd let go of the lever, grabbed the woman under her arms, and pulled with every ounce of strength she possessed. The woman had screamed, a sound of pure animal agony, as her leg had come free. And then Lysandra had been dragging her through the mud, up the slope, away from the rising water. Her muscles had burned, her lungs had felt like they might burst, but she hadn't stopped until they'd reached higher ground. The woman had passed out from the pain. Her leg had been a mess, clearly broken, possibly crushed beyond repair. And they'd still been in the middle of a violent storm, miles from any shelter that could accommodate 2 people. "What have I done?" Lysandra had whispered, staring at the unconscious woman, at the responsibility she'd just taken on. She could barely keep herself alive. How was she supposed to care for someone else? But then she'd looked at the woman's face, slack with unconsciousness, rainwater mixing with blood, and she'd seen herself. Cast out, hurt, left to die by a world that didn't care. "Come on!" She'd grabbed the woman again, began the agonizing process of dragging her toward camp. "We're both going to survive this. Both of us. I didn't pull you out of that water just to let you die in my arms." The journey back had been a nightmare. Every few feet, Lysandra had to stop, gasping for breath, her arms shaking with exhaustion. The woman had been dead weight, her body limp and heavy. Lightning had continued to flash, thunder to roll, rain to pour in sheets that made visibility almost zero. But Lysandra had kept moving, one foot in front of the other, one more pull, one more step. Don't stop, don't quit, don't let her die. When they'd finally reached her shelter, she'd been so exhausted she'd almost collapsed alongside her patient. But there had been no time for rest. The woman's leg needed to be set, her wounds cleaned, her body kept warm and dry. Lysandra had worked through what remained of the night, drawing on half-remembered lessons from watching Dr. Merrick treat minor injuries at Vale Manor. She'd straightened the leg as best she could, trying to ignore the grinding sound of bone on bone, and splinted it with straight branches and strips torn from her own dress. She'd cleaned the wounds with boiled water, packed them with moss to stop the bleeding, wrapped them in the cleanest cloth she had. The woman had regained consciousness once during the process, her eyes flying open, her hand grabbing Lysandra's wrist with surprising strength. "Who are you?" she'd gasped. "Someone who knows what it's like to need help." Lysandra had met her eyes steadily. "Rest now. We'll talk later." The woman had studied her face for a long moment, something sharp and assessing in her gaze despite the pain, and then she'd nodded once and slipped back into unconsciousness. Dawn had broken gray and exhausted, the storm finally spent. Lysandra had sat back against the wall of her shelter, looking at the stranger she'd just risked everything to save, and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. The woman had slept for 18 hours straight. Lysandra had kept watch, changing her bandages, keeping her warm, forcing water between her lips when she'd stirred. It had been strange having another person in her space after so long alone. Strange, but not entirely unwelcome. When the woman had finally woken fully, her eyes had been clear and sharp, taking in everything about the shelter with the practiced assessment of someone used to evaluating situations quickly. "You saved my life," she'd said, her voice still weak but stronger than before. "In that storm, with the tree and the water, you could have died trying to help me." Lysandra had shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with the gratitude in the woman's eyes. Anyone would have done the same. No. The woman had shaken her head firmly. Most would have kept walking. Most would have saved themselves. You didn't even know me. I know what it's like to be left to die. The words had come out harder than Lysandra had intended. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. The woman had been quiet for a moment, her eyes studying Lysandra with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "You're not a hunter. Your hands are too soft, even with the calluses. And your accent, that's not frontier speech. You're from the cities, from money." Lysandra had tensed. "That's none of your concern." "Perhaps not, but I'm wondering why a woman of obvious breeding is living alone in the deep woods, wearing rags and surviving on fish and foraged roots." The woman had paused. "I'm wondering if it has anything to do with that brand on your shoulder." Lysandra's hand had flown to her shoulder, covering the mark through her dress. "How did you—" "I saw it when you were changing my bandages. You thought I was unconscious, but I wasn't. Not entirely." The woman's expression had been unreadable. "That's a murderer's brand, kingdom justice, but you don't seem like a murderer to me." "Then you're a fool." Lysandra had stood abruptly, her jaw tight. "I should have left you in that ravine." "But you didn't." The woman had held her gaze. "Why?" "Because I'm tired of death." The words had burst out of Lysandra like a dam breaking. "Football, because everyone I cared about is gone, and everyone who claimed to care about me turned away, and I am so damn tired of being alone and afraid," and she'd cut herself off, breathing hard, shocked at her own outburst. The woman had waited, patient and still, until Lysandra's breathing had calmed. Then she'd spoken, her voice gentle but firm. "My name is Alara Nightshade, and despite what you might think, I'm not here to judge you or turn you in or cause you harm." She'd paused. "In fact, I think we might be able to help each other. I don't need help. Everyone needs help, child. That's not weakness. It's survival." Alara had shifted, wincing as her broken leg protested. "I was traveling with a merchant caravan headed to the northern trade posts. We were attacked by bandits 3 days ago. Most of the guards were killed. The merchants scattered. I ran into the woods and got lost in the storm, and ended up pinned under a tree." "Yes." Alara's smile had been wry. "Not my finest moment. But here's what I'm proposing. You help me heal, keep me alive until my leg mends enough to travel. In return, I'll teach you things that might help you survive better out here. I've traveled these frontier lands for 30 years. I know herbs that can heal wounds, plants that can be eaten, ways to trap game that you've probably never thought of." Lysandra had wanted to refuse, wanted to tell this stranger to leave as soon as she could walk, to take her gratitude and her knowledge and go. Trusting people had destroyed her life. Darian had been trusted, and he'd used that trust to murder Rowan and frame her for it. But even as the refusal had formed on her lips, she'd found herself thinking about the long, lonely months, about talking to birds because there was no one else, about the constant fear, the near starvation, the nights when she'd wondered if she'd survive until dawn. "How do I know you won't turn me in?" she'd asked quietly. "How do I know you won't run to the nearest settlement and bring back soldiers?" Alara had looked at her for a long moment, something sad and knowing in her eyes. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted, to have the whole world convinced you're something you're not." She'd pulled back her sleeve, revealing her own wrist. There, faded but still visible, had been a brand, different from Lysandra's, but a brand nonetheless. "I was marked as a thief 23 years ago, caught stealing bread to feed my children after my husband died. I was innocent. The merchant who accused me had been the actual thief, covering his own crimes. But no one cared. Justice is for the rich, child. The rest of us just try to survive it. Lysandra had stared at that faded brand, at the proof that she wasn't alone in her injustice, and something tight in her chest had loosened just a fraction. 3 months, she'd said finally. I'll help you for 3 months, long enough for your leg to heal. After that, you go your own way and forget you ever saw me. Agreed. Alara had held out her hand. Lysandra had hesitated, then taken it. The handshake had been firm, sealing a bargain between two outcasts in a shelter made of sticks and hope. She couldn't have known then that this moment, this decision to save a stranger in a storm, would set in motion events that would eventually bring down a kingdom. All she'd known was that for the first time in months, she wouldn't be facing the wilderness alone. The days that followed had settled into a rhythm that was almost comfortable. Alara's leg had been badly broken, but the bones had been clean breaks rather than shatters. A small mercy in a situation with few of them. With proper splinting and rest, Alara had assured her, it would heal. Not as good as new, the older woman had admitted, examining the splint Lysandra had constructed. I'll probably walk with a limp for the rest of my days, but I'll walk. In the meantime, she'd made herself useful in ways that had transformed Lysandra's survival from desperate scrambling to something approaching stability. You've been eating bitter root, Alara had said on the third day, examining Lysandra's food stores with a critical eye. That's what's been giving you stomach cramps. It's edible, technically, but you need to soak it in water overnight first to leach out the toxins. I didn't know that. Why would you? You were raised to manage servants, not forage for roots. Alara's tone had been matter-of-fact rather than mocking. But that's the thing about survival. Knowledge matters more than breeding. Now see this plant here? The one with the jagged leaves? That's wild garlic. Excellent for flavoring food, and it has natural healing properties. You've been walking past it for months. Lysandra had learned, voraciously, desperately, storing away every piece of information as if her life depended on it, because it did. Alara had taught her which mushrooms were safe and which would kill her in hours, how to read weather signs in the sky and animal behavior, how to construct better snares, more effective shelters, how to preserve meat by smoking it over green wood. You're a quick study, Alara had observed after a week. That'll serve you well out here. But it hadn't been all practical lessons. In the evenings, as they'd sat by the fire and listened to the forest settle into darkness, they'd talked. At first, Lysandra had been guarded, deflecting personal questions, keeping her story locked tight behind her teeth. But Alara had been patient, sharing her own history piece by piece. Her childhood in a fishing village, her marriage to a sailor, her years of struggle after his death, her false conviction, and the brand that had marked her forever. I ran, Alara had said simply. Like you. The frontier was the only place where a branded woman could start over, where the law's reach ended and survival mattered more than past sins. I've spent 2 decades out here, trading with settlements, learning the land, making a life. Don't you want to go back? Lysandra had asked. To prove you were innocent? Who would I prove it to? The merchant who accused me is probably dead by now. The magistrate who sentenced me definitely is. I checked. Alara had smiled without humor. No, child. Some injustices don't get fixed. Sometimes survival is the only justice we get. The words had settled over Lysandra like a shroud. Was that her future? A life in the wilderness, surviving but never truly living, her name forever stained by Darian's lies? I can't accept that, she'd whispered. My husband was murdered. The man who killed him is living in our house, spending our money, being praised as a righteous friend who sought justice. I won't let that stand. Alara had studied her across the firelight, something calculating in her expression. Tell me what happened. All of it. Leave nothing out. And so Lysandra had. The whole story had poured out. Rowan's death, the poison, Darian's accusations, the planted evidence, the false testimony, the trial that had been a mockery of justice. She'd told Alara about her love for Rowan, about the life they'd built together, about the morning she'd woken to find him dying in their bed. When she'd finished, tears had been streaming down her face, and Alara's expression had been grim. This Darian, the older woman had said slowly. Describe him to me. Tall, lean, pale gray eyes, dark hair, always perfectly groomed. He wore his wealth quietly, but you could see it in every gesture, every word. Rowan said he came from Old Money, one of the kingdom's founding families. Alara had gone very still. Darian Ashford? Lysandra had jerked upright. You know him? I know of him. Every trader who works the frontier knows of the Ashford family. Alara's voice had been tight. They control most of the trade routes between the capital and the northern territories. Wealthy beyond measure, politically connected, and absolutely ruthless with anyone who gets in their way. Rowan never mentioned you. Why would he? To Rowan, Darian was just his childhood friend, his trusted companion. But I've heard stories, child. Merchants who refused to sell to Ashford interests found their caravans raided by bandits. Competitors who bid against them on trade contracts were mysteriously accused of crimes and driven from business. The Ashfords don't just accumulate power, they eliminate anyone who might threaten it. Lysandra's blood had run cold. Are you saying Darian killed Rowan for power? I'm saying that if your husband controlled lands or trade routes that Darian wanted, your husband's death would have been very convenient. Alara had leaned forward. Think, what did Rowan control that Darian might have wanted? The Vale estates border the western trade routes. Rowan always said he wanted to open them to smaller merchants, to break the monopoly that a few families held. Lysandra's eyes had widened. The Ashfords were one of those families. Darian argued with Rowan about it more than once, said he was being naive, that the old families had earned their control. And if Rowan died and his estates passed to distant relatives who would need an executor to manage things until succession was settled. Lysandra had felt sick. Darian positioned himself as executor. He controls everything now. And the western routes stay closed. Alara's smile had been sharp as a blade. Your husband wasn't killed out of passion or madness, child. He was killed for profit, for power, for control of trade routes worth more than gold. The revelation had been both horrifying and oddly comforting. Horrifying because it confirmed that Rowan's death had been calculated, planned, executed with cold precision. Comforting because it gave Lysandra something she desperately needed. A motive that made sense, a pattern that could be proven. If I could find evidence, she'd said slowly, if I could prove Darian wanted those trade routes, that he benefited from Rowan's death, you'd still be a branded exile with no legal standing, no resources, and no one willing to listen. Alara's voice had been gentle but firm. I understand the desire for justice. Truly, I do. But wanting it and achieving it are very different things. Then what do I do? Just accept it? Live out here forever while he prospers? I don't have an answer for you, child. I wish I did. Alara had sighed. But I can tell you this. If you're going to have any chance at justice, you need to survive first. You need to be strong, smart, and ready for when opportunity presents itself. Because, in my experience, opportunity always comes eventually. The question is whether you're prepared to seize it. The conversation had stayed with Lysandra through the following weeks. She'd thrown herself into learning everything Alara could teach her, transforming from a struggling exile into someone who understood the wilderness, who could read its signs and use its resources. Her hands had grown calloused and strong. Her body had become lean and hard. The frightened noblewoman who'd stumbled into these woods had been replaced by something fiercer, something forged in the fire of survival. 2 months after saving Alara, on a day when the summer heat lay heavy over the forest and cicadas sang their endless song, everything changed. They'd been at the stream, Lysandra checking her fish traps while Alara, now able to walk with a crutch, gathered watercress from the shallows, when they'd heard horses. The sound had frozen them both. Horses meant riders. Riders meant either frontier bandits or kingdom soldiers, and neither option was good. Hide, Alara had hissed, but Lysandra had already been moving, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward a dense thicket of brambles. They'd burrowed into the thorny undergrowth just as the riders had emerged from the trees. There had been 6 of them, all men, all wearing the black and silver of the royal guard. But it was the 7th rider, the one they surrounded like a living shield, who had made Lysandra's breath catch in her throat. He'd been tall and broad-shouldered, sitting his massive black stallion with the easy confidence of someone born to command. His hair had been dark as midnight, his jaw strong and clean-shaven, his clothing simple but clearly expensive. Even from a distance, Lysandra had sensed the power radiating from him. Not the petty power of wealth or title, but something more fundamental. The power of someone whom others obeyed without question. The stream's here, Your Majesty, one of the guards had said. The horses need water. Your Majesty. Lysandra's heart had nearly stopped. This was King Kale Nightshade, the Alpha King, whose territories stretched across half the known world. The man whose reputation for ruthlessness in war was matched only by his reputation for absolute justice in peace. The king who'd united the fractured northern kingdoms under his rule and held them through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. And he was less than 30 feet from where she hid. We'll rest here briefly, Kael had said, his voice deep and carrying a note of command that probably came as naturally as breathing. The horses are tired. As the guards had dismounted and led their horses to water, Kael had remained in his saddle, his gaze sweeping across the forest with sharp assessment. For one terrible moment, his eyes had seemed to pass directly over their hiding spot, and Lysandra had been certain he'd seen them. But he'd looked away, his attention moving on to his guards, and she'd released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Beside her, Elara had gone absolutely rigid, her face drained of color. "We need to leave," the older woman had breathed, so quietly Lysandra had barely heard her. "Now, before he—" "Lady Mother?" The voice had cut through the forest sounds like a knife through silk. Kael had dismounted, moving toward their hiding spot with long, purposeful strides. His guards had looked up in confusion, hands going to weapons, but he'd waved them back. "Lady Mother, I know you're there. I'd recognize your presence anywhere." Elara had closed her eyes, her hands trembling. When she'd opened them again, they'd been filled with resignation and something else, something that looked almost like love. "How did you find me?" she'd called out, not moving from their hiding place. "Your disappearance was reported 3 days ago. The merchant said you'd been lost in the wilderness, probably dead." Kael had stopped at the edge of the brambles, his eyes finally finding them in the shadows. "I didn't believe it. You're too stubborn to die in a storm." "I almost did," Elara had admitted. "If not for—" She'd glanced at Lysandra, then seemed to make a decision. "If not for help, I would have drowned." Kael's gaze had shifted to Lysandra, and the full force of his attention had hit her like a physical thing. His eyes had been silver gray, almost the same color as Darian's, but somehow completely different. Where Darian's had been cold and calculating, Kael's had been sharp and assessing, missing nothing. "You," he'd said slowly, "you saved my mother's life." It hadn't been a question, but Lysandra had found herself nodding anyway, her throat too tight for words. Something had flickered across Kael's face. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. Then he'd turned back to his mother. "Come out, both of you. I give you my word as king that no harm will come to you." Elara had emerged first, limping on her crutch, her chin raised with quiet dignity. Lysandra had followed more slowly, acutely aware of her ragged dress, her wild hair, the way she must look like some forest creature compared to the gleaming soldiers and their royal master. Kael had studied them both in silence. Then his eyes had caught on Lysandra's shoulder, where the edge of her brand was visible through a tear in her dress. His expression had hardened. "You're marked." "I am." Lysandra had lifted her chin, matching his gaze despite the fear making her knees weak. "Branded a murderer and exiled to die in the wilderness. But your mother would be dead if I'd let justice stand in the way of mercy." "Lysandra saved my life," Elara had said firmly, moving to stand beside her. "Risked her own to pull me from a flooding ravine, nursed me through fever, kept me alive when I had every reason to die. I don't care what mark she bears. She's a better person than most who walk free in your cities." Kael's jaw had tightened, but he'd looked at his mother with obvious concern. "You should have sent word. I've had 300 men searching." "I couldn't exactly walk to the nearest settlement with a broken leg," Elara had interrupted, "and Lysandra had no reason to help me contact anyone. As far as she knew, I was just another traveler lost in the woods." "Is that true?" Kael had turned back to Lysandra. "You didn't know who she was?" "I knew her name," Lysandra had said quietly. "Elara Nightshade. I didn't realize the connection to—" She gestured helplessly at his royal person. "No one does. My mother doesn't use her title in the frontier lands." His gaze had been piercing. "Tell me, woman with the murderer's mark, are you actually a murderer?" Every instinct had screamed at Lysandra to lie, to equivocate, to give him an answer that wouldn't condemn her. But she'd looked into those silver eyes and found herself speaking a truth she'd barely admitted to herself. I'm branded for the murder of my husband. I was accused, tried, convicted, and exiled. By every law in your kingdom, I'm guilty. She'd paused. But I didn't kill him. I loved him more than my own life, and I didn't kill him. Someone else did, and they framed me for it, and no one would listen when I tried to tell the truth. Names, Kyle had demanded. Give me names. My husband was Lord Rowan Vale. My accuser was Darian Ashford. The trial was held before the Grand Council in Vale City. The words had tasted like ash. But it doesn't matter now. I'm dead to that world. This wilderness is my kingdom now. Something had flickered across Kyle's face. Recognition, perhaps, or suspicion. But before he could speak, Alara had stepped forward. My son, I owe this woman my life. Whatever she may or may not have done, she showed me mercy when she had every reason to save only herself. I'm asking you, as your mother, to show her the same mercy. The tension had stretched between them like a bowstring pulled taut. The guards had watched, hands on weapons, clearly uncertain about the strange scene unfolding before them. Finally, Kyle had nodded once, short and sharp. Very well, he'd pointed at Lysandra, have my protection for as long as my mother vouches for you. Any who harm you, harm her, and through her, harm me. He'd glanced at his captain. That clear? Crystal, your majesty. Good. Kale had turned back to Alara. Now, mother, you're going to get on a horse and return to civilization where you belong. You can argue all you want, but that leg needs proper healing. I'm not leaving Lysandra alone out here. She won't be alone. Kale's expression had been unreadable. She's coming with us. Lysandra's stomach had dropped. What? No, I can't. I won't go back. You won't go back to the kingdom proper, Kyle had clarified. But my mother clearly needs assistance while she heals, and you've proven yourself capable. You'll come to my northern fortress, help her recover, and in exchange you'll have shelter, food, and safety. His eyes had hardened. Refuse, and I'll have you bound and brought anyway. My mother's life is worth more than your comfort. It hadn't been an offer. It had been a command, backed by the force of a king who was clearly used to being obeyed. Lysandra had looked at Alara, who'd given her a small, encouraging nod. Then she'd looked at the forest that had been her home, her prison, her purgatory for the past months. And she'd made a choice that would change everything. I'll come, she'd said quietly, for your mother's sake. But I'm not one of your subjects, your majesty. I'm an exile, a ghost. Don't expect me to bow and scrape. Kale's lips had twitched, not quite a smile, but close. I wouldn't dream of it, Lady Ghost. And with that, Lysandra Vale had mounted a horse for the first time in months and ridden away from the wilderness that had nearly killed her toward a future she couldn't begin to imagine. Behind them, her shelter had stood empty, a testament to survival against impossible odds. Ahead, a fortress waited, and within its walls, a truth that would shake kingdoms. The fortress emerged from the mountain mist like something from a fever dream, all black stone and iron gates perched on cliffs that dropped away into nothingness. Lysandra had seen castles before, had lived in one, but Blackridge Fortress was something else entirely. This wasn't built for comfort or display. This was built for war. Welcome to my home, Kyle had said, as they had approached the massive gates. It's not as pretty as the southern palaces, but it's never fallen to siege. Lysandra hadn't answered. She'd been too busy trying to control the panic clawing at her chest. With every mile they'd traveled from the wilderness, she'd felt more exposed, more vulnerable. The forest had been harsh but predictable. This fortress, with its armed guards and stone walls, felt like a trap waiting to spring. The gates had opened to reveal a courtyard filled with soldiers drilling, smiths hammering at forges, servants rushing between buildings with purposeful efficiency. Everyone had stopped to stare as Kyle had ridden in with his mother, and the ragged woman who looked more wild animal than human. Your Majesty, a tall woman in commander's insignia had approached, her eyes sliding over Lysandra with barely concealed suspicion. We weren't expecting you back for another week. Plans changed. My mother was injured in the frontier lands. Kael had dismounted, moving to help Ilara from her horse with surprising gentleness. She'll need the healers immediately, and prepare a room for her companion. Her companion? The commander's gaze had fixed on Lysandra's shoulder, where the brand was now fully visible through her torn dress. Sire, that woman is marked. I'm aware, Commander Thorne, she's under my protection. Kael's voice had held a warning that made even the hardened warrior step back. Anyone who questions that answers to me personally. The message had been clear. The stares had continued, but no one had dared voice their objections. They'd taken Ilara away to the healing wing, leaving Lysandra standing in the courtyard like a piece of abandoned luggage. Kael had turned to her, his expression unreadable. You'll stay in the East Tower. It's private, away from the main quarters. A servant will bring you clothes, food, whatever you need. He'd paused. The door won't be locked. You're a guest, not a prisoner. But I'd advise against wandering the fortress alone. My soldiers are loyal, but they're also curious. A branded woman under the king's protection is unprecedented. Why are you doing this? The question had burst from Lysandra before she could stop it. Your mother's safe now. You could have left me in the woods. Kael had studied her for a long moment, those silver eyes seeming to see straight through her skin to something beneath. Because my mother believes you're innocent, and my mother is an excellent judge of character. He'd stepped closer, lowering his voice. But understand this. I'm not doing this out of kindness. I'm doing this because I want the truth. About you, about your husband's death, about Darian Ashford, and you're going to give it to me. Then he'd walked away, leaving Lysandra alone in a courtyard full of warriors who looked at her like she might explode at any moment. The room they'd given her had been simple but clean, a far cry from her chambers at Vale Manor, but paradise compared to her shelter in the woods. There'd been a real bed with actual linens, a wash basin with clean water, a window that looked out over the northern mountains. Lysandra had stood at that window for an hour, just staring, trying to reconcile the fact that she was here, alive, in the home of a king who'd promised both protection and interrogation. A servant had arrived with clothes, simple but well-made, sized to fit her lean frame. Another had brought food, roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables she hadn't tasted in months. Lysandra had eaten slowly, savoring every bite, trying not to think about what came next. She'd known, of course. Kael wanted answers, and she'd have to decide how much truth to give a man who could either save her or destroy her with a single word. 3 days had passed in strange limbo. Lysandra had spent her time with Ilara, helping the fortress healers tend to the older woman's injuries. The healers had been professional but cold, clearly uncomfortable with a branded murderer in their domain. Lysandra had ignored their whispers, focused on what she could control. You're good at this, one of the younger healers had admitted grudgingly, as Lysandra had expertly changed Ilara's bandages. Where did you learn? Necessity, Lysandra had answered simply. When you're alone in the wilderness, you either learn to heal yourself or you die. The healer had fallen silent, but her expression had softened slightly. Perhaps she'd seen something beyond the brand, the competence, the careful hands, the knowledge that came from genuine care rather than training. Ilara had recovered quickly with proper treatment. By the 4th day, she'd been sitting up, taking meals, even walking short distances with her crutch. And she'd been watching Lysandra with increasing concern. My son will want to speak with you soon, she'd said quietly during one of their sessions. He's been gathering information about your case, about Darian Ashford. Lysandra's hands had stilled on the bandage she'd been wrapping. What kind of information? The kind that a king can gather when he puts his resources to work. Ilara's expression had been serious. Kael is many things: warrior, ruler, strategist, but above all, he values truth. If he thinks an injustice has been done, he'll tear apart kingdoms to set it right. Even for a branded exile? Even for a woman who saved his mother's life? Ilara had reached out, grasping Lysandra's wrist. But you need to understand, Kael won't just accept your word. He'll interrogate you, test you, push you to breaking to see if your story holds. It's how he operates. Don't take it personally. And if he decides I'm guilty after all? Ilara's silence had been answer enough. The summons had come on the 5th night. A guard had appeared at Lysandra's door, his expression carefully neutral. His Majesty requests your presence in his private study, now. The walk through the fortress had been a gauntlet. Soldiers had stopped to stare. Servants had whispered behind their hands. By the time they'd reached the heavy oak door of Kael's study, Lysandra's heart had been hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The guard had knocked once, then opened the door and stepped aside. Kael's study had been exactly what she'd expected. Functional, sparse, dominated by maps and correspondence. The king himself had been standing at a large table covered in documents, still wearing his training clothes, his dark hair damp with sweat. He'd looked up as she'd entered, and something had flickered across his face. Not the cold assessment she'd expected, but something more complicated. "Sit," he'd said, gesturing to a chair opposite him. Lysandra had remained standing. "I prefer not to." That wasn't a request. Their eyes had locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Lysandra had sat, but she'd kept her spine straight, her chin high. She might be an exile, but she wouldn't grovel. Kael had nodded as if she'd passed some invisible test, and sat as well. Then he'd pushed a document across the table toward her. "Read this." It had been a report, detailed, thorough, clearly compiled by someone with access to official records. Lysandra's hands had trembled as she'd scanned the contents. The report had covered her trial in brutal detail, but it had also included things that hadn't been presented to the Grand Council. Discrepancies in the testimony, questions about the poison's origin. A note that the guard who'd supposedly witnessed her affair had died under suspicious circumstances. His horse had been found with a cut girth, suggesting sabotage rather than accident. And there, at the bottom, a financial analysis of the Vale estates and trade routes, a breakdown of who had gained from Rowan's death. Darian Ashford's name had appeared 17 times. "Where did you get this?" Lysandra had whispered. "I have sources in the capital, people who owe me favors, or fear, or both." Kael had leaned back in his chair. "When my mother told me about your case, I had them dig deeper. What they found was interesting. This proves I was framed. This proves that the evidence against you was questionable and that Darian Ashford benefited substantially from your husband's death." Kael's tone had been precise, legal. "It doesn't prove you're innocent. Coincidence and motive aren't the same as proof." "Then why show me this?" "Because I want to hear your version, all of it. Every detail you remember from the day your husband died until the day you pulled my mother from that ravine." Kael's eyes had been intense, unblinking. "And I'll know if you're lying. I've interrogated hundreds of people. I can read deception like other men read books." So Lysandra had told him everything. She'd started with the morning she'd found Rowan dying, the blue tinge to his lips, the way his hand had reached for hers in those final moments. She'd described Darian's immediate accusation, the planted vial, the mockery of a trial. She'd talked about her exile, her near death in the wilderness, the months of survival that had stripped away everything but her will to live. And as she'd talked, Kael had listened with an intensity that had been almost physical. He'd asked questions, sharp, probing questions that had forced her to relive details she'd tried to forget. He'd pushed her on inconsistencies, challenged her assumptions, made her defend every claim. It had been exhausting, brutal. By the time she'd finished, tears had been streaming down her face, and her voice had been raw. Kael had been quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Then he'd spoken, his voice thoughtful. "I believe you." Lysandra had stared at him in shock. "What?" "I believe you're innocent. Or at least, I believe you didn't poison your husband." He'd stood, moving to the window that overlooked the fortress courtyard. "The evidence against you was too perfect, too convenient. Real murders are messy, full of mistakes and panic. This was orchestrated." "Then help me prove it." Lysandra had risen as well, hope flaring in her chest for the first time in months. "You're a king. You have power, resources. I have power in my own territories. Vale City is 3 kingdoms away, under the jurisdiction of the Grand Council." Kael's expression had been grim. "I can't simply march in and overturn their verdict. It would be seen as an act of aggression, possibly even war. So I'm still condemned." "Not necessarily." Kael had turned to face her fully. "But proving your innocence will require more than documents and suspicions. It will require evidence that even the Grand Council can't ignore. And getting that evidence will be dangerous." "I don't care about danger." I care about justice. Do you care about revenge? The question had been sharp, cutting, because that's what this will feel like. We'll need to destroy Darian Ashford completely. His reputation, his fortune, his freedom. Are you prepared for that? Lysandra had thought of Rowan, of his final moments, of the life they'd been building together before it was all torn away. She'd thought of Darian standing before the Grand Council, tears in his eyes, condemning her while he lived in her home and spent her husband's money. Yes, she'd said simply. I'm prepared. Kael had studied her for another long moment. Then he'd nodded, a decision clearly made. Then we have work to do, but first you need to understand something. He'd moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the small space. If we do this, if we go after Darian Ashford, you'll be putting a target on your back. He's protected by one of the most powerful families in the kingdom. He has allies in the Grand Council, connections to trade guilds, resources we can barely imagine. And if he realizes you're alive and seeking justice, he'll come for you with everything he has. Let him try. Lysandra's voice had been hard as steel. I survived the wilderness. I can survive him. Confidence is good. Overconfidence is fatal. Kael's expression had been serious. You'll need training, real training, not just survival skills. You'll need to learn how to defend yourself, how to move in society again, how to present evidence and build a legal case. And you'll need to be patient. This won't happen quickly. How long? Months. Maybe longer. He'd paused. Are you willing to stay here, in my fortress, under my protection, for however long it takes? The question had hung between them, loaded with implications. Staying meant abandoning the wilderness, the isolation that had kept her safe. It meant trusting Kael, trusting Alara, trusting that this path would lead somewhere other than another betrayal. But it also meant a real chance at proving her innocence, at honoring Rowan's memory, at making Darian pay for what he'd done. I'll stay, Lysandra had said, but I have conditions. Kael's eyebrow had raised. You're not really in a position to make demands. I'm not demanding. I'm negotiating. She'd held his gaze. I won't be treated like a prisoner or a charity case. If I'm staying here, I work. I earn my keep. And I'm part of every decision about my case. No secrets, no manipulation, no plans made behind my back. Anything else? If we prove Darian killed Rowan, I want to be there when he's arrested. I want to look him in the eye when his world comes apart. Her hands had clenched into fists. I've earned that. Kael had been quiet for a moment, then he'd held out his hand. Agreed. You work, you participate, and when the time comes, you'll have your confrontation. His grip had been strong when she'd taken his hand. Welcome to Blackridge Fortress, Lysandra Vale. Let's bring down a murderer. The next 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity that had left Lysandra's head spinning. True to his word, Kael had put her to work. She'd started in the fortress infirmary, using the healing skills she'd learned from Alara and expanded under the tutelage of the fortress healers. At first, they'd been resistant, treating her like a contamination. But Lysandra had proven herself with patient after patient, her hands steady, her knowledge solid. You're wasted on bandages, the head healer, a gruff man named Marcus, had admitted after she'd successfully set a soldier's broken arm. With proper training, you could be a master healer. I had proper training, Lysandra had replied quietly. I just learned it in a forest instead of a hall. Marcus had grunted, but there'd been respect in his eyes. She'd also begun training with the fortress guards. Kael had insisted, and Lysandra had quickly understood why. If she was going to confront Darian, she needed to be able to defend herself. The wilderness had made her strong, but it hadn't made her a fighter. Commander Thorne had been her primary instructor, and the woman had shown no mercy. You're too slow, she'd barked during their first session, easily disarming Lysandra for the third time. Speed matters more than strength. Again. Lysandra had attacked again, and again, and again. Her body had ached, her muscles had screamed, but she'd kept going. Every bruise was a lesson. Every failure was information. Better, Thorne had finally admitted after Lysandra had managed to land a hit. You learn fast. Good. You'll need every advantage you can get. But the real work had happened in the evenings, in Kael's study, where they'd pored over documents and correspondence, building a case piece by careful piece. Darien controls the western trade routes now, Kael had explained, pointing to a map. But he's expanding. 3 merchants who refuse to partner with Ashford interests have had their caravans raided in the last 2 months. One is dead, the other's bankrupted. Can we prove Darien's behind it? Not directly. He's too smart to leave obvious trails. Kael's expression had been frustrated. But there's a pattern. Every raid happens to someone who's opposed Ashford expansion. That's not coincidence. Then we need someone on the inside, Lysandra had said slowly. Someone who works for Darien, who has access to his correspondence, his financial records. And who would risk betraying one of the most powerful men in the kingdom? Kael had shaken his head. That's asking someone to commit suicide. Not if we offer them protection. A new life, a new identity, resources to start over somewhere Darien can't reach. Lysandra had leaned forward. People don't stay loyal to monsters out of love. They stay out of fear. Remove the fear, offer hope, and some might turn. Kael had looked at her with something that might have been admiration. You're learning to think like a strategist. I'm thinking like a survivor. There's a difference. They'd sent out feelers through Kael's network of spies and informants, looking for disgruntled servants, overlooked clerks, anyone who might have access to Darien's private affairs and a reason to want revenge. The response had come 2 weeks later. We have someone, Kael had announced, bursting into the infirmary where Lysandra had been treating a soldier's infected wound. A clerk in Darien's household. He's willing to talk, but only in person, and only to you. Lysandra's hands had stilled. Why me? He says he knew your husband, says Rowan showed him kindness when no one else would. Kael's expression had been serious. He's in the border town of Greystone, 3 days' ride from here. We leave at dawn. Is it a trap? Possibly. Probably, Kael had shrugged. But it's also the best lead we've had. And if Darien knows you're alive and working against him, we'll find out soon enough. They'd ridden out the next morning, Kael, Lysandra, and 6 of his best guards, all dressed in civilian clothes to avoid drawing attention. The journey through the mountains had been hard but beautiful, the spring air crisp and clean, so different from the oppressive forest where Lysandra had spent months surviving. You've changed, Kael had observed on the second night, as they'd sat around their campfire while the guards took watch. You're not the same woman I found in the woods. I died in those woods, Lysandra had said quietly. The person I was, Lady Vale, the noblewoman who trusted the system to protect her, she's gone. What's left is someone harder, someone who knows that justice doesn't just happen. You have to fight for it. That's a dangerous philosophy. It's a survival philosophy. The only one that works when the world's against you. She'd looked at him across the flames. Why are you really doing this? And don't say it's just because I saved your mother. You could have given me gold and sent me away. Instead, you're risking political complications, maybe even conflict with the Grand Council. Why? Kael had been quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he'd finally spoken, his voice had been low, almost vulnerable. Because I've seen too many innocent people destroyed by those with power and no conscience. I've watched corruption fester in courts and councils, watched good people suffer while villains prosper. He'd looked up, meeting her eyes. And because my mother was right about you, you're not a murderer. You're a survivor. And survivors deserve better than to be forgotten in the wilderness. Something had shifted between them in that moment. An understanding, perhaps, a recognition of shared purpose. Thank you, Lysandra had whispered. Don't thank me yet. We still have to survive Greystone. The town had been larger than Lysandra had expected, a trading hub where the mountain roads met the river routes, busy, prosperous, and full of eyes. They'd entered at dusk, hoods drawn, and made their way to a nondescript inn where the clerk had arranged to meet. The common room had been crowded with merchants and travelers. Kael had secured a private room upstairs, and they'd waited. The clerk had arrived an hour after dark. He'd been young, maybe 20, with nervous eyes and hands that wouldn't stop trembling. He'd introduced himself as Thomas, and he'd looked at Lysandra as if seeing a ghost. Lady Vale, he'd breathed. They said you were dead. Darien says a lot of things. Lysandra had kept her voice gentle despite the urgency clawing at her. You knew my husband? Lord Rowan hired me when I was 16. I've been caught stealing food, and instead of turning me over to the magistrate, he gave me work in his household." Thomas's eyes had filled with tears. "He was kind, so kind. When he died, I believed what Darian said about you, but then I saw things, heard things, and I realized, what did you see?" Kyle had leaned forward, his presence making the small clerk shrink back. "I saw Darian burning documents the night before Lord Rowan's death, private letters, financial records. He said he was just organizing, but he was destroying them. And I heard him talking to a man I didn't recognize, someone who wasn't part of the household. They spoke about trade routes, about obstacles being removed." Lysandra's heart had begun to race. "Did you hear my husband's name?" "Not exactly. But Darian said once the fool is gone, the western routes are ours." And the next day, Thomas had swallowed hard. The next day, Lord Rowan was dead. "That's circumstantial," Cale had said, though his expression had been intense. "Not enough for a conviction. There's more." Thomas had pulled a folded document from inside his coat with shaking hands. "I kept records. Every time Darian met with that stranger, every payment that went through the household accounts to unknown parties. It's all here, coded, but I can translate it." Lysandra had reached for the document, but Thomas had pulled it back. "I need your promise first. If I give you this, if I testify against Darian Ashford, he'll destroy me. He'll destroy my family. I need protection for all of us." "You have my word as king," Kyle had said solemnly. "Provide the evidence, testify truthfully, and you and your family will be under my permanent protection. New identities, new lives, in territories where Ashford influence doesn't reach." Thomas had studied Kyle's face, searching for deception. Then he'd handed over the document. "There's something else you need to know," he'd said quietly. "Darian's been asking questions about exiles in the Northern Territories, about a woman matching your description." His eyes had fixed on Lysandra with fear and pity. "He knows you're alive, and he's coming for you." The room had gone silent. Lysandra had felt her blood turn to ice. "How long have we got?" Kyle had demanded. "He left Vale City 4 days ago with 30 armed men. If he's riding hard," Thomas had done quick calculations. "Maybe 2 days. Maybe less. We need to leave. Now." Kyle had stood, his hand going to his sword. "If Darian catches us here..." The window had exploded inward. Glass had shattered across the room as a figure in black had rolled through, blade already drawn. Behind him, Lysandra had heard shouts from the street, the sound of steel on steel as Kyle's guards engaged with attackers. "Run!" Kyle had roared, his own sword appearing in his hand as he'd moved to intercept the assassin. But Lysandra hadn't run. She'd grabbed Thomas, who'd frozen in terror, and dragged him toward the door. They'd made it 2 steps before another assassin had appeared in the doorway, blocking their escape. The man had smiled, a terrible cold expression, and raised his crossbow. Time had seemed to slow. Lysandra had seen the bolt, seen the trajectory, seen Thomas's death written in the air. And she'd moved. The training with Commander Thorne had been brutal, but it had taught her reflexes she'd never had before. Lysandra had yanked Thomas to the side, throwing them both to the floor as the bolt had whistled past where his head had been. The assassin had cursed, reaching for another bolt. He'd never loaded it. Kyle had appeared behind him like a shadow, his blade finding the gap in the man's armor with surgical precision. The assassin had dropped without a sound. "Out the back!" Kyle had grabbed Lysandra's arm, hauling her to her feet. "There's a service stair." Another window had shattered. Then another. The inn had erupted into chaos, screams, fighting, the smell of blood and smoke. They'd run. Lysandra, Kyle, Thomas, and 3 of Kyle's guards who'd fought their way up from the common room. Down the back stairs, through the kitchen where terrified staff had cowered, out into an alley that stank of garbage and death. "The horses are this way," one of the guards had panted. "If we can just..." He died mid-sentence, a crossbow bolt through his throat. Lysandra had screamed, but Kyle had kept moving, kept dragging her forward, even as more bolts had hissed through the air. They'd reached the stable where their horses had been waiting, and for one blessed moment, Lysandra had thought they might make it. Then Darian Ashford had stepped out of the shadows. He'd looked exactly as Lysandra remembered, tall, lean, impeccably dressed even for an ambush. But his pale gray eyes had held a madness she'd never seen before, a fury that made him seem less than human. "Hello, Lysandra," he'd said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "I've been looking for you." Darian. Her own voice had been steady, though her heart had felt like it might explode. "Come to finish what you started?" "I didn't start this. You did, when you refused to simply die like you were supposed to." He'd taken a step forward, and Lysandra had seen the other men with him, 15, maybe 20, all armed, all focused on their small group. "You should have stayed buried in the wilderness, should have accepted your exile, but you had to survive, had to find powerful friends." His eyes had flicked to Kael. "Even seduced a king. Very resourceful." "I didn't seduce anyone," Lysandra had spat. "I told the truth. Something you wouldn't recognize." "Truth?" Darian had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Truth is whatever story people believe. And they believed you were a murderer because I made sure the evidence was perfect. Because I controlled the narrative, just like I'm controlling this one. You killed Rowan." The words had torn from her throat. "You murdered your best friend for trade routes and gold. Rowan was weak. He would have destroyed everything our families built with his naive idealism." Darian's expression had hardened. "I gave him chances to see reason. He refused. So I removed him and took what should have been mine from the beginning. It was business, Lysandra, nothing personal." "Nothing personal?" Fury had exploded through her, hot and blinding. "You killed my husband! You framed me for murder! You destroyed my life and called it business. And now I'm going to finish the job." Darian had drawn his sword, the blade gleaming in the moonlight. "Kill them all! Make it look like bandits! No survivors!" His men had moved forward as one. Kael's remaining guards had engaged, their blades flashing, but they'd been outnumbered 5-1, and Lysandra had known with sick certainty that they were about to die. Then Thomas had done something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. He'd run straight at Darian screaming, a knife somehow in his hand. Darian had cut him down without hesitation, his blade opening the young clerk's throat in a spray of arterial blood. Thomas had fallen, his eyes wide with shock, the document still clutched in his dying hands. "No!" Lysandra had screamed, lunging forward. Kael had caught her, holding her back even as she'd fought against him. "We have to go, now!" "The document is covered in blood and dying with him." Kael had practically thrown her onto a horse. "Ride or die here. Choose," Lysandra had chosen. She'd grabbed the reins, kicked her horse into motion, and fled into the night with Kael beside her and Darian's fury following like a wolf pack on fresh scent. Behind them, Greystone had burned, Darian's men torching the inn to destroy evidence, to create chaos, to hide murder in the flames. And somewhere in that burning building, Thomas's body had turned to ash, taking with it the proof they'd needed to bring Darian down. They'd ridden through the night, pushing the horses to the edge of collapse, listening for pursuit that never quite materialized. By dawn, they'd reached the mountain pass that led back to Blackridge Fortress, and only then had Kael allowed them to stop. Lysandra had dismounted on legs that could barely hold her, her mind replaying Thomas's death over and over. He'd died helping her, died holding evidence that might have proven her innocence, and she had nothing to show for it. "We failed," she'd whispered, staring at her blood-stained hands. "Thomas is dead, the documents destroyed, and Darian knows everything." Kael had dismounted as well, his expression grim. "We didn't fail. We survived. And Darian made a mistake tonight." "What mistake?" "He killed our witness and destroyed our evidence. He revealed himself." Kael had moved to stand in front of her, his hands gripping her shoulders. "He admitted to killing your husband. He confirmed everything we suspected. And he did it in front of witnesses. My guards saw him, heard him confess." "Your guards' testimony won't mean anything to the Grand Council. They'll say the guards are biased, that they're lying to protect their king's interests." "Probably. But we're not done." Kael's eyes had been intense, burning with purpose. "Darian's afraid now. Afraid enough to send assassins, to risk exposure, to burn down an entire inn. Fear makes people sloppy. And sloppy people make mistakes we can exploit." Lysandra had wanted to believe him, but all she could see was Thomas's blood, hear his last scream, feel the weight of another death on her conscience. "I'm tired of people dying for me," she'd said brokenly. "Rowan died because Darian wanted power. Thomas died because he tried to help me. How many more before this ends?" "As many as it takes." Kael's voice had been hard, but not unkind. "That's the cost of justice, Lysandra. That's the price of standing against powerful people who think they're above consequence. I'm sorry. I wish it were different, but it's not." He'd been right. She'd known he was right, but that knowledge had done nothing to ease the grief crushing her chest. They'd returned to Blackridge Fortress as the sun had risen over the mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and blood. Alara had been waiting at the gates, her face pale with worry that had turned to relief when she'd seen them alive. "Thank the fates," she'd breathed, pulling Lysandra into an embrace despite her crutch. When the messenger bird arrived saying you'd been attacked. "We're fine, Mother," Kael had said, though his expression had told a different story. "But we have a problem." In his private study, they'd laid out the situation. Darian knew Lysandra was alive and working against him. He had resources, men, and the willingness to kill anyone who got in his way. And they'd lost their best chance at solid evidence when Thomas had died. "So what do we do now?" Lysandra had asked, exhaustion making her voice flat. "How do we fight someone who controls everything?" Kael had been quiet for a long moment, studying the maps on his wall. Then he'd turned, and there'd been something dangerous in his expression, something that reminded Lysandra that this man hadn't become king through kindness alone. "We stopped playing by their rules," he'd said quietly. "Darian wants a war fought in shadows and courts. We'll give him a war, but we'll fight it on our terms, with weapons he doesn't expect." "What kind of weapons?" "The truth, not hidden in documents or whispered by frightened clerks, but shouted from every corner of the kingdom until it can't be ignored." Kael had leaned forward. "We're going to turn Darian's own tactics against him. We're going to control the narrative." Lysandra had looked at him, at the determination in his eyes, at the promise of justice that might finally, impossibly, be within reach. And despite everything, despite the death and the fear and the overwhelming odds, she'd felt hope kindle in her chest like a flame refusing to be extinguished. "Tell me how," she'd said. Kael had smiled, a wolf's smile, sharp and dangerous. "First, we make you impossible to ignore. Then we make Darian impossible to defend." And as he'd begun to outline his plan, Lysandra had understood that the real battle was only just beginning. The plan Kael outlined had been audacious to the point of insanity, and Lysandra had loved it immediately. "We can't prove your innocence through traditional channels," he'd said, spreading maps across his desk as dawn light filtered through the windows. "The Grand Council is too corrupt, too influenced by families like the Ashfords, so we bypass them entirely." "How?" Lysandra had leaned forward, ignoring the exhaustion pulling at her bones. "We take your story directly to the people, not through official channels, not through courts and councils, but through the merchants, the travelers, the common folk who've been crushed by Ashford monopolies for years." Kael's finger had traced routes across the map. "We spread the truth like wildfire, that you're alive, that you were framed, that Darian Ashford murdered his best friend for profit. We make it impossible for the council to ignore because the entire kingdom is demanding answers." Alara had been standing by the window, and she'd turned with a troubled expression. "That's dangerous, Kael. If you publicly oppose the Grand Council's verdict, it could be seen as an act of rebellion. They might move against you." "Let them try." Kael's voice had been hard. "I've unified the Northern Territories through strength and fair governance. My people are loyal. The council knows that open conflict with me would split the kingdom." He'd paused. "But they also know I've never directly challenged their authority before. So we need to be smart about this. We don't declare war, we simply ask questions. Loud, public, impossible to ignore questions." "What kind of questions?" Lysandra had asked. Why was a woman convicted of murder based solely on testimony from people who benefited from her husband's death? Why was contradictory evidence ignored? Why did the supposed witness die before he could be cross-examined? Kael had ticked off points on his fingers. "We don't accuse the council of corruption. We just point out inconsistencies and let people draw their own conclusions." It had been brilliant. Subversive without being openly rebellious. But Lysandra had seen the flaw immediately. No one will care about the questions if they don't care about me. I'm just another exile, another criminal. Why would common people risk Ashford retaliation to support someone they don't know? Because we're going to make them know you. Kael had met her eyes. And we're going to make them see themselves in your story. Over the next 2 weeks, Lysandra had undergone a transformation that had been both thrilling and terrifying. Kael's advisors had worked with her on public speaking, teaching her to project her voice, to hold a crowd's attention, to tell her story in a way that resonated with people who'd never known wealth or privilege. Don't talk about your title or your fine clothes, one advisor had instructed. Talk about love. Talk about loss. Talk about how it feels to be powerless when the system turns against you. That's universal. That's what people will understand. Commander Thorne had continued her combat training, pushing Lysandra harder than ever. You need to look strong, Thorne had said, disarming her for the 20th time that session. When you stand before crowds, they need to see someone who survived impossible odds, a warrior, not a victim. I'm not a warrior. You killed a fish with a rock to avoid starvation. You pulled my king's mother from a flooding ravine in a thunderstorm. You stared down Darian Ashford while assassins tried to murder you. Thorne had handed back her practice sword. You're more of a warrior than half my guards. You just need to believe it. And slowly, painfully, Lysandra had started to believe. The first test had come 3 weeks after their return from Greystone. Kael had organized a public gathering in the fortress courtyard, ostensibly a celebration of his mother's recovery, but actually a carefully staged opportunity for Lysandra to address a crowd. 200 people had assembled, soldiers, servants, townspeople from the nearby settlement, merchants who traded with the fortress. Lysandra had stood on a raised platform, her heart hammering so hard she'd thought everyone must be able to hear it. She'd worn simple clothes, well-made but not fancy, and her hair had been pulled back to fully expose the brand on her shoulder. Kael had insisted on that last part. Don't hide it, he'd said. Own it. Make them see what injustice looks like. Now, standing before those 200 faces, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile, Lysandra had understood what he'd meant. This brand was her proof, her evidence, her testimony written in scar tissue. She'd taken a breath and begun to speak. My name is Lysandra Vale, and I was condemned to die in the wilderness for a murder I didn't commit. The courtyard had gone silent. I was married to a good man named Rowan. We were happy. We had plans for a future together. And then one morning, I woke to find him dying in our bed, poison in his blood, and no way to save him. She'd let the words hang there, watching faces in the crowd soften with sympathy. I was accused by a man I trusted, a man my husband called friend. The evidence against me was overwhelming, too perfect, too convenient. But I had no power to fight it, no resources to hire advocates or investigators. I was just a woman, newly widowed, grieving and terrified, facing a system that had already decided I was guilty. A murmur had run through the crowd. Some had nodded. They knew that feeling, that powerlessness. The Grand Council convicted me based on testimony from people who inherited my husband's wealth and lands after his death. They branded me a murderer and threw me into the frontier woods to die. And I almost did. Lysandra had touched her shoulder, the brand beneath her clothes. I almost starved, almost froze, almost gave up. But I refused to die. I refused to let an innocent woman's story end in an unmarked grave. Why should we believe you? Someone had shouted from the crowd. Every criminal claims innocence. You're right. Lysandra had located the speaker, a middle-aged merchant with suspicious eyes. And if I asked you to believe me based on nothing but my word, I'd be asking too much. But I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look at the evidence, to ask questions. She gestured to Kael, who'd stepped forward with documents prepared for this moment. Ask why the man who accused me now controls all my husband's lands and trade routes. Ask why every merchant who opposed him has been ruined or killed by bandits. Ask why the witness who supposedly saw me commit adultery died in a convenient accident before he could be cross-examined. Lysandra's voice had grown stronger with each word. Ask why a woman with everything to lose would risk it all to poison a husband who gave her everything she wanted. The merchant had fallen silent, his expression thoughtful. Another voice had risen, a woman this time. Even if you're innocent, what can we do? The Grand Council's verdict is final. You're marked. You're condemned. Maybe. But the council answers to the people, even if they pretend otherwise. If enough voices demand answers, demand a reinvestigation, demand justice, they'll have to listen. Lysandra had met the woman's eyes. I'm not asking anyone to fight my battles. I'm just asking you to think, to question. And if you believe an injustice was done, to speak about it. Tell your neighbors. Tell merchants from other territories. Make noise that can't be ignored. There'd been a long moment of silence. Then one person had started clapping, slow, deliberate. Others had joined. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. Enough to tell Lysandra that the message had landed. After the gathering, Kael had found her in the fortress gardens, where she'd been trying to process what had just happened. You were magnificent, he'd said simply. I was terrified. Terrified but effective. Half those people will be talking about you by nightfall. The merchants will carry your story along the trade routes. Within a week, people in 3 kingdoms will know your name. He'd paused. How does it feel? Like standing on the edge of a cliff. Lysandra had looked at him. Once we jump, there's no going back. No, there isn't. Kyle had moved to stand beside her, both of them looking out over the mountains. Darian will retaliate. Probably soon, probably violently. Are you ready for that? I've been ready since Greystone. She'd touched her shoulder again, the brand that had become armor instead of shame. Let him come. This time, I won't be running. Darian's retaliation had come sooner than expected, and from a direction they hadn't anticipated. 2 days after Lysandra's speech, a messenger had arrived at Blackridge Fortress, bearing the seal of the Grand Council. The letter had been addressed to King Kael Nightshade, and its contents had made even the unflappable king's jaw tighten. They're summoning me to the capital, he'd said, reading the formal script, to answer questions about my harboring of a convicted criminal and my interference in council jurisdiction. Lysandra's stomach had dropped. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap. Darian's using his council connections to pull me away from my territories, to isolate me where his influence is strongest. Kael had set down the letter with deliberate care. But if I refuse the summons, it gives them grounds to declare me in rebellion. That plays into Darian's hands. Civil war would let him seize even more power in the chaos. Then we go together. Lysandra had stood, her decision made. If they want to judge you for protecting me, I should be there to testify. Absolutely not. Kael's response had been immediate and sharp. Walking into the capital is suicide for you. Darian would have you killed before you reach the council chambers. So you go alone and let them manipulate you without anyone to tell your side. I go with enough guards to ensure my safety and enough political leverage to make them think twice about overt moves against me. Kael had stood as well, his expression brooking no argument. You stay here, continue building support among the people, and stay alive. That's the plan. But Lysandra had learned something in the wilderness, something the sheltered noblewoman she'd once been had never understood. Sometimes the only way to win was to break the rules entirely. I have a different plan, she'd said quietly. Kael had looked at her warily. I'm not going to like this, am I? Probably not. But Lysandra had moved to his map table, studying the routes between Blackridge and the capital. You're right that I can't walk into the council chambers, but what if I don't need to? What if, while you're answering their questions in private, I'm outside telling my story to the people in the streets? That's even more dangerous. Everything about this is dangerous. Her voice had risen with frustration. Hiding here is dangerous. Letting Darian control the narrative is dangerous. Playing by rules designed to keep people like me powerless is dangerous. So, yes, my plan is dangerous. But it's also the only way we win. Ilara had entered the study in time to hear the last part. What plan? Lysandra had explained. How she'd traveled to the capital separately from Kael, in disguise, with a small group of trusted guards. How she'd stay in the common districts where Ashford influence was weakest. How she'd speak in market squares and taverns, telling her story to anyone who'd listen, building grassroots support while Kael faced the council. It's insane, Ilara had said flatly. You'll be walking into the heart of enemy territory with a target painted on your back. I've been walking around with a target on my back since the day I was branded. Lysandra had met the older woman's eyes. This is just making it official. Mother and son had exchanged a long look, one of those silent conversations that only family could have. Finally, Elara had sighed. She reminds me of you at that age, she'd told Kael. Too stubborn to listen to reason, too brave for her own good, and absolutely determined to do the right thing regardless of cost. That's not reassuring, Mother. It wasn't meant to be. Elara had turned to Lysandra. If you're going to do this, you'll need more than a handful of guards. You'll need allies in the capital, people who can hide you, move you, get you to safety if things go wrong. Do you have such allies? I have contacts from my trading days, people who owe me favors, who hate the Ashfords as much as you do. Elara had smiled grimly. Let me make some arrangements. The next week had been a whirlwind of preparation. Lysandra had trained intensively with Commander Thorne, learning not just combat but evasion, disguise, how to move through crowds without being noticed. She'd practiced her speech until she could deliver it in her sleep, adjusting the words for different audiences, dock workers, market vendors, servants who'd know exactly what it felt like to be powerless. Kael had tried one more time to talk her out of it the night before they were set to leave. This could get you killed, he'd said bluntly. Darien will have assassins everywhere. One mistake, one person who recognizes you, and you're dead. I know the risks. Do you? Because I don't think you fully understand what you're walking into. The capital isn't like the frontier territories. It's Ashford's domain, built on corruption and controlled through fear. The people there have been beaten down for so long, they might not even care about your story. Then I'll make them care. Lysandra had met his intense gaze without flinching. I survived 3 months alone in the wilderness. I stared down Darien while he confessed to murder. I'm not afraid of his city. You should be. I am. She'd smiled without humor. But I'm more afraid of spending the rest of my life as a ghost, hiding and surviving but never truly living. Rowan deserves better than that. I deserve better than that. Kael had been quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he'd pulled her into an embrace, brief but fierce. Come back alive, he'd murmured against her hair. That's an order from your king. I'm not one of your subjects, remember? But she'd held on for a moment longer than necessary. I'll come back, I promise. They'd left Black Ridge at different times, taking different routes. Kael had departed first with his official entourage, 20 guards in royal livery, banners flying, making no secret of his journey. A week later, Lysandra had slipped out disguised as a servant traveling with a merchant caravan, accompanied by 4 of Kael's best warriors dressed as common guards. The journey had taken 12 days, moving slowly to avoid suspicion. Lysandra had spent the time observing how servants behaved, how they spoke, how they made themselves invisible to the nobles and merchants around them. It had been humbling. She'd once been one of those nobles who'd looked through servants as if they were furniture. They'd entered the capital just after dawn when the city was waking and the gates were crowded with farmers bringing goods to market. Lysandra had kept her head down, her brand covered, her posture that of someone too tired and beaten by life to be worth noticing. The capital had been overwhelming. After months in the wilderness and weeks in Blackridge's relative simplicity, the sheer size and noise and smell of the city had hit her like a physical force. Tens of thousands of people crammed into streets that wound between buildings 4 and 5 stories tall, all of them shouting and bargaining and living lives that had nothing to do with Lysandra Vale or her quest for justice. Elara's contact had been a woman named Mira, who ran a boarding house in the merchant district. She'd been in her 50s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, and she'd taken one look at Lysandra before ushering her inside. "So you're the dead lady everyone's talking about," she'd said, bolting the door behind them. "Elara said you'd need a place to stay and people who could move you around the city without attracting notice." "That's right. Can you help?" "Depends. Are you really innocent, or is this some elaborate con?" Mira's gaze had been piercing. "Because I don't risk my neck for liars." Lysandra had pulled down her collar, showing the brand. "I'm branded a murderer for a crime I didn't commit. My husband was poisoned by his best friend, who then framed me and took everything we'd built together. I've spent months surviving in the wilderness, and I've come back to prove the truth. That's not a con. That's my life." Mira had studied the brand, then Lysandra's face. Whatever she'd seen there had satisfied her, because she'd nodded. "Good enough. You can stay here, but you'll work like everyone else. serving tables, cleaning rooms, whatever needs doing. It'll help you blend in, and the customers who come through here love to gossip. Good place to spread a message." She'd paused. "Alara said you're planning to speak publicly. That's dangerous. Ashford has eyes everywhere." "I know, but it's necessary." "Then we'll need to be smart about it. I know people, tavern owners, market administrators, dock foremen, people who can spread word of a gathering without it being traced back to us." Mira's expression had been calculating. "Give me 2 days to set something up." Those 2 days had been torture. Lysandra had worked in the boarding house, serving meals to merchants and travelers, listening to their conversations, learning about the city. And she'd heard Darian's name everywhere, spoken with respect by some, fear by others, hatred by a surprising number. "Ashford's been squeezing the independent merchants," one trader had complained over his evening ale, "demanding exclusive contracts, raising fees on the trade routes. Anyone who refuses gets their shipments lost or raided by convenient bandits." "I heard he's got the Grand Council in his pocket," another had added. "Half of them owe him money or favors. He could probably get away with murder at this point." "He already has," Lysandra had murmured, quiet enough that only Mira had heard. The older woman had shot her a warning look. "Not yet. Wait for the right moment." On the third day, Kyle's official arrival had electrified the city. Lysandra had watched from the boarding house window as his procession had moved through the streets toward the council chambers. All pageantry and power, designed to remind everyone that he was a king who commanded armies and territories. "He's making a statement," Mira had observed, showing the council they can summon him, but they can't intimidate him. Will it work? In the council chambers? Maybe. In the streets? Mira had smiled. "That's where you come in." The gathering Mira arranged had been in a large market square in the heart of the merchant district. Not officially sanctioned, but not illegal either, just a space where people gathered, where merchants set up temporary stalls, where news and gossip flowed like water. Lysandra had arrived at midday dressed in plain clothes, her brand visible, her guards positioned in the crowd to watch for threats. A small platform had been set up, supposedly for a merchant to auction goods, but empty now, waiting. Mira had stood on a crate and called out, "Anyone want to hear a story? A true story about justice and power and what happens when the system fails?" Curious faces had turned. A few people had drifted over, then more. Within minutes, a crowd of 50 had gathered, and they'd looked at Lysandra with mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She'd climbed onto the platform, her heart racing, and begun to speak. "My name is Lysandra Vale. Some of you may have heard that name, the woman convicted of murdering her husband, sentenced to exile, assumed dead in the frontier wilderness." She'd turned, showing them the brand. "I'm here to tell you that I didn't die, and I'm here to tell you the truth about what happened." The crowd had grown larger as she'd spoken. She'd told them everything: Rowan's death, Darian's accusation, the planted evidence, the trial that had been predetermined. She'd described the wilderness, the struggle to survive, the cold certainty that she'd been left to die. And then she'd told them about the pattern, the merchants ruined, the competitors eliminated, the trail of bodies and broken lives that followed Darian Ashford like a plague. "He didn't just kill my husband," she'd said, her voice carrying across the square. "He's been killing this city, this kingdom, one honest person at a time. And he's gotten away with it because we've been afraid to speak up, afraid of his money, his connections, his power." "What do you want us to do?" someone had shouted. "We're just merchants and workers. We can't fight the Ashfords." "I'm not asking you to fight. I'm asking you to talk. Tell your friends, your families, your business partners. Ask questions, loud questions that demand answers. Why was I convicted on testimony from people who inherited my husband's wealth? Why have so many of Ashford's competitors died or been ruined? Why does the Grand Council refuse to investigate despite mounting evidence of corruption?" The crowd had murmured, some nodding, others still skeptical. "I know it's dangerous to question powerful people," Lysandra had continued. "I know the risks better than anyone, but I also know that silence is how they win. Every time we stay quiet out of fear, we give them permission to destroy another life, ruin another business, murder another innocent person." She'd paused, letting the words sink in. "I refuse to be silent anymore. The question is, will you join me?" For a long moment, nothing had happened. Then a woman in the crowd had stepped forward, middle-aged, worn, with the hands of someone who worked hard for little pay. "My brother was a merchant," she'd said, her voice shaking but determined. 2 years ago, he refused to sell his business to Ashford interests. A month later, his warehouse burned down. The city guard said it was an accident, but my brother said he'd been threatened, told to sell or suffer consequences. She'd looked at Lysandra. "He's dead now. Hanged himself," they said, but I never believed it. He wasn't the type. Other voices had risen then, each with their own story. A shopkeeper whose competitor had mysteriously disappeared after bidding against Ashford on a trade contract. A servant who'd worked in an Ashford household and heard things no one was supposed to hear. A dock worker who'd seen Ashford's men unload unmarked crates in the dead of night and been warned to forget what he'd seen. The stories had poured out like water from a broken dam, each one adding to a picture of systematic corruption and violence that made Lysandra's personal tragedy part of something much larger. "Tell everyone," Lysandra had urged as the crowd swelled to hundreds. "Tell everyone you know. Make noise. Demand investigation. And when the Grand Council tries to silence you, make even more noise. Because they can ignore one voice, but they can't ignore thousands." The gathering had lasted for hours. By the time it had broken up, Lysandra had been hoarse and exhausted, but the message had been sent. People were talking, questioning, angry. That night Mira had smiled as they'd counted coins from the auction. "You started something today," she'd said. "Half the city's buzzing about the dead lady who came back. Ashford's people are scrambling, trying to control the narrative. Will it be enough? To convict him in a court? Maybe not, but to destroy his reputation, to make him toxic to business partners and political allies." Mira had nodded. "That's already happening. People are pulling back from Ashford contracts, worried about association. That's power you're wielding now." Over the next week, Lysandra had held 3 more gatherings in different parts of the city. Each time, the crowds had grown larger. Each time, more people had come forward with stories of Ashford corruption. And each time, the city guard had watched from the edges, but hadn't intervened, either because they couldn't justify arresting someone for speaking their truth, or because some of them agreed with what she was saying. Kael had been locked in council chambers during this time, and Lysandra had gotten only brief messages from his guards. The proceedings were going poorly. The council was hostile, but he was holding his own. On the 8th day, everything had changed. Lysandra had been preparing for another gathering when one of Kael's guards had burst into the boarding house, his face pale. "You need to come now," he'd gasped. "The king, he's been arrested." The world had tilted. "What?" "The Grand Council has charged him with harboring a fugitive and interfering in their jurisdiction. They're holding him in the council prison until a formal trial can be arranged." The guard's hands had been shaking. "It's a setup. Darian's behind it. If we don't get him out, where is he?" "The council prison, but it's guarded by 100 men, and we only have—" Lysandra hadn't waited to hear more. She'd grabbed her cloak and run. The council prison had been in the heart of the government district, a fortress within the city. Lysandra had pushed through the crowds gathered outside. Word of the king's arrest had spread fast until she'd reached the gates. "I demand to see King Kael Nightshade," she'd shouted at the guards. "I'm the fugitive he's accused of harboring. If you want me, I'm right here." The guards had stared at her in shock, clearly not expecting the fugitive to simply walk up and announce herself. "That's her," someone in the crowd had yelled. "That's Lysandra Vale." Within minutes, more guards had appeared, and then council officials, and then, striding through the chaos with a smile of absolute triumph, Darian Ashford. He'd looked at her with cold satisfaction. "Lysandra, how convenient. I was hoping you'd do something foolish." "Release King Kael," she'd demanded. "Your quarrel is with me, not him." "My quarrel is with everyone who defies order and justice." Darian had gestured, and guards had moved to surround her. "You're both going to stand trial. Him for treason against the Grand Council's authority. You for being exactly what we convicted you of the first time." The crowd had erupted in shouts, some supporting Darian, others supporting Lysandra. The noise had been deafening. And then Kael had appeared, flanked by guards being led from the prison. His hands had been bound, but his expression had been furious. "Darian Ashford," he'd called out, his voice carrying over the chaos. "I challenge you to trial by truth. Here, Before these witnesses, let us both present our evidence and let the people decide who's lying. The crowd had gone silent. Trial by truth was an ancient custom, rarely invoked, but legally binding under Old Kingdom law. If Darian accepted, both sides would present their cases publicly, and a jury of common citizens would render verdict. Darian's smile had faltered. That's unnecessary. We have courts for... Are you afraid? Kale's words had cut like a blade. Afraid that in an honest forum, without your bought judges and intimidated witnesses, your lies will be exposed? I fear nothing from a disgraced exile and a king who shelters criminals. Then accept the challenge. Kyle had stepped forward as far as his guards would allow. Unless you're admitting that you can't win without controlling the process. The crowd had begun to murmur, some calling for Darian to accept, others shouting encouragement. The pressure had been immense, public, impossible to deflect. Darian's jaw had tightened. He'd been trapped, refuse and look like a coward. Accept, and risk exposure. Very well, he'd said finally. Trial by truth. Tomorrow at noon, in the Grand Square. Let's see whose story the people believe. And with that, the stage had been set for a confrontation that would determine not just Lysandra's fate, but the future of justice in the entire kingdom. That night, Lysandra and Kyle had been allowed to meet under guard in a council chamber. They'd had 1 hour to prepare their case. This is it, Kyle had said, maps and documents spread between them. Everything rides on tomorrow. If we lose, we won't lose. Lysandra had been surprised by the certainty in her own voice. We have truth on our side. That has to count for something. Truth without proof is just a story. But Kyle had smiled grimly. Lucky for us, we've been gathering proof. They'd worked through the night, building their case, preparing witnesses who'd agreed to testify despite the danger. The merchants whose businesses had been destroyed, the servants who'd heard Ashford plotting, the dock workers who'd seen evidence of smuggling and worse. And at the center of it all, Lysandra's testimony, raw, honest, impossible to ignore. As dawn had broken over the capital, Lysandra had stood at the window, watching the city wake, and felt a strange calm settle over her. Whatever happens today, she'd said quietly, I want you to know you gave me my life back. Not the life I had before, but something better. A life with purpose. Kyle had joined her at the window. You gave yourself your life back. I just provided the platform. Then let's make sure we use it well. At noon, the Grand Square had been packed with thousands of people, more than Lysandra had seen in one place in her entire life. A platform had been erected in the center, with space for speakers and witnesses. The Grand Council had sat in an elevated box, their expressions carefully neutral. And spread throughout the crowd, Lysandra had known, were Darian's people, ready to shout her down or worse. But there had also been faces she recognized from her gatherings. The woman whose brother had died, the merchants who'd been ruined, the dock workers and servants and common people who'd suffered under Ashford corruption. They'd come. They'd risk Darian's wrath to be here, to witness this. Darian had spoken first, presenting his case with polished eloquence. He'd painted Lysandra as a manipulative seductress who'd murdered her husband for wealth, then seduced a king to escape justice. He'd produced witnesses, guards who'd supposedly seen her with the poison, servants who'd testified to her cold demeanor toward Rowan. The crowd had murmured, some nodding, convinced by the familiar narrative. Then it had been Lysandra's turn. She'd climbed onto the platform, her brand fully visible, and looked out at the sea of faces. Some hostile, some curious, many just waiting to see what she'd say. I'm not going to tell you that Darian Ashford is lying, she'd begun. I'm going to show you. And she'd done exactly that. She'd walked them through the evidence, the timeline that didn't make sense, the witnesses who'd benefited from Rowan's death, the guard who'd conveniently died before he could be cross-examined. She'd presented documents showing Darian's financial gain from the Vale estates. She'd called witnesses who testified to the pattern of violence and intimidation that followed Ashford business dealings. But most powerfully, she'd told them about Greystone. Darian Ashford stood in an alley and admitted to killing my husband, she'd said, her voice ringing across the square. He said Rowan was weak, that he had to be removed, that it was just business. And then he ordered his men to kill everyone who'd heard his confession. Lies, Darian had roared. She invents stories to save herself. Then explain why a clerk in your household died trying to bring evidence against you, Lysandra had shot back. Explain why you burned down an entire inn to destroy that evidence. Explain why you've left a trail of dead merchants and ruined businesses wherever your interests are threatened. The crowd had erupted, some shouting support for Lysandra, others for Darian. The Grand Council had looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting the trial to become so heated. Cale had stepped forward, then, adding his testimony, describing the assassination attempt in Greystone, the pattern of Ashford corruption his investigation had uncovered, the systematic way Darian had used murder and intimidation to build his empire. This isn't about one woman's guilt or innocence, Kyle had declared. This is about whether we live in a kingdom where the powerful can murder with impunity, or a kingdom where justice applies equally to all. The debate had raged for hours. Witness after witness had come forward on both sides. But slowly, inexorably, the tide had begun to turn. The sheer volume of testimony against Darian, the consistency of the pattern, the raw emotion in Lysandra's voice when she spoke about Rowan, it had all added up to something that couldn't be dismissed as mere accusation. As the sun had begun to set, the Grand Council had called for a vote, not a verdict that would come from a citizen's jury, but a decision on whether there was sufficient evidence to warrant a full investigation into Darian Ashford's activities. The crowd had gone silent, thousands of people holding their breath. The council members had conferred, and then, one by one, they'd raised their hands, 10-2 in favor of investigation. The square had exploded with noise, cheering, shouting, a release of tension that had been building for hours. Lysandra had felt her knees go weak, and only Kael's hand on her arm had kept her upright. Darian's face had gone white, then red with fury. "This is a farce. You're condemning me based on rumor and conspiracy." "We're investigating based on credible testimony and documented evidence," the head councilman had replied, his voice cold. "You'll have full opportunity to defend yourself. But until this investigation is complete, your assets are frozen and you're confined to house arrest." "You can't. We can, and we are." The councilman had gestured and guards had moved toward Darian. "Take him." For a moment, Lysandra had thought Darian might fight. His hand had moved toward his sword, his eyes had blazed with rage, but he'd been surrounded by guards, by thousands of witnesses, by the weight of public opinion that had finally, impossibly, turned against him. He'd allowed himself to be taken, but as he'd passed Lysandra on the platform, he'd leaned close enough to whisper, "This isn't over. I have resources you can't imagine, connections that go deeper than this council. You've won a battle, but the war continues." "Then bring it," Lysandra had whispered back. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." And she'd meant it. Standing there on that platform, with the crowd's cheers washing over her like a wave, with Kael beside her and truth finally being heard, Lysandra had felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real, tangible, burning bright. The investigation had been ordered. Questions were being asked. And for the first time since Rowan's death, justice seemed possible. The investigation had begun within hours of the council's vote, but Darian's warning had proven prophetic. His connections ran deeper than anyone had imagined, and his resources were vast enough to make the truth a difficult quarry to catch. Lysandra had remained in the capital as the investigators worked, living still in Mira's boarding house, continuing to speak to crowds that grew larger with each passing day. The woman who'd been cast into the wilderness to die had become a symbol, not just of her own struggle, but of everyone who'd ever been crushed by the powerful and told their suffering didn't matter. But symbols, Lysandra had learned, made excellent targets. The first attempt on her life had come 3 days after the trial, by Truth. She'd been walking back to the boarding house after speaking in the market square when a man had stepped from an alley with a knife. Only the combat training from Commander Thorne had saved her. She'd seen the attack coming, twisted away, and her guard had put the man down before he could strike again. The would-be assassin had been questioned, but he died of poison before he could reveal who'd hired him. The message had been clear enough without confession. "You need to leave the capital," Kael had urged during one of their secret meetings. "Go back to Blackridge where I can protect you properly." "No." Lysandra's response had been immediate. "Leaving now looks like I'm afraid, like I'm running again. That destroys everything we've built. Being dead destroys everything, too. Then we finish this quickly." She'd leaned forward across the table they'd commandeered in a private room at Mira's. The investigation is taking too long. Every day that passes, Darian's people destroy more evidence, intimidate more witnesses. We need something concrete, something undeniable.
Like what? We've already presented everything we have.
Not everything. Lysandra had been thinking about this for days, turning it over in her mind like a stone being polished by water. We have testimony, we have patterns, we have suspicious deaths and convenient accidents, but we don't have the murder weapon. We don't have the poison that killed Rowan. Cale's eyes had sharpened. The vial they found in your room was destroyed after the trial, as is standard procedure with evidence. But who's to say there was only one vial? Lysandra had pulled out documents she'd been studying, copies of the household accounts from Vale Manor in the weeks before Rowan's death. Look at this. 3 weeks before Rowan died, there's a payment to an apothecary in the merchant district. 50 gold pieces, far more than any normal medicine would cost. It could be anything. Or it could be poison, expensive, rare poison that doesn't leave obvious traces. Lysandra had traced the entry with her finger. The payment was authorized by the head steward, but I remember Rowan questioning it. He said he hadn't ordered any expensive medicines. The steward claimed it was a mistake in the ledger. And you think this steward was working for Darian? I think the steward was bribed or threatened into making the purchase and hiding it in the accounts. And I think if we find that apothecary, we might find records of what was bought and who it was made for. Cale had studied the document, his mind clearly working through the implications. It's a slim lead. It's more than we had yesterday. They'd found the apothecary 2 days later, a small shop in the merchant district that specialized in rare herbs and compounds. The owner had been an elderly man named Henrik, who'd kept meticulous records of every sale for the past 40 years. At first, he'd been reluctant to share information with strangers, asking about purchases from months ago. But when Lysandra had explained who she was and what she was searching for, something in the old man's eyes had shifted. I remember that sale, he'd said slowly, pulling out a leather-bound ledger. I remember because the man who bought it made me uncomfortable. He kept looking around as if afraid someone would see him. And the compound he requested, Henrik had shaken his head. It was a poison, slow-acting, tasteless, nearly undetectable. I almost refused to make it. Why didn't you? He said it was for controlling pest rats in a nobleman's estate. It's a legitimate use. The compound kills slowly enough that the rats return to their nests before dying, which prevents the bodies from rotting in the walls. Henrik's hands had trembled on the ledger. But I had doubts, so I kept extra detailed records of that transaction. He'd turned the book to show them an entry dated 3 weeks before Rowan's death. The description matched perfectly. A rare poison derived from nightshade and oleander, expensive to produce, deadly in the right dose. And there, in Henrik's careful script, was the name of the purchaser. Marcus Grayson, the head steward of Vale Manor. This is it, Lysandra had breathed. This proves the poison was purchased before Rowan's death by someone in our household. It proves the steward bought poison, Cale had corrected. We still need to connect it to Darian. But that connection had come from an unexpected source. Henrik had pulled out another document, a receipt bearing the Ashford family seal, authorizing payment for the compound. The man gave me this, Henrik had explained. Said his master wanted official documentation for such an expensive purchase. I thought it odd at the time. Why would a steward need his master's seal to buy rat poison? But I filed it away. Cale had held the receipt up to the light, examining the seal carefully. This is genuine. Darian's personal seal, not the family's general mark. He signed off on this purchase himself. Why would he be so stupid? Lysandra had wondered aloud. Because he thought you'd be dead before anyone thought to investigate, Cale had said grimly. He thought he'd controlled the narrative so completely that no one would question his version of events. This receipt was just paperwork to him, meaningless once you were gone. They'd brought the evidence to the council investigators, who'd immediately arrested Marcus Grayson. The steward had been questioned for 6 hours before he'd finally broken. Lysandra had been allowed to observe through a one-way mirror, and she'd watched as the man she'd once trusted, the man who'd managed Rowan's household with such apparent competence, crumbled under interrogation. Darian Ashford approached me 2 months before Lord Rowan's death, Marcus had confessed, his voice hollow. He said Lord Rowan was making dangerous decisions about the trade routes, decisions that would hurt both our families. He offered me gold, more gold than I'd earn in 10 years of service, if I'd help ensure those decisions were never implemented. Help how? The investigator had pressed. By purchasing a compound and administering it to Lord Rowan's wine over a period of weeks, small doses, undetectable, building up in his system until Marcus had buried his face in his hands. Darian said it would look natural. That a young man dying suddenly wasn't that unusual, that I'd be helping prevent a larger disaster. And you believed him? I believed the gold, and I believed the threats. Marcus had looked up, his eyes red. Darian said if I refused, my daughter would meet with an accident. He showed me her daily route to the market. He described what would happen to her in detail. What choice did I have? You could have gone to Lord Rowan, warned him, and watched my daughter die, watched myself be branded as a traitor and hung? Marcus had laughed bitterly. I was a coward. I chose my family over my master, and Lady Lysandra paid the price. Watching through the mirror, Lysandra had felt a complicated mix of emotions. Rage at the betrayal, yes, but also a terrible understanding. Marcus had been caught in the same trap she'd been, powerless against someone with more money, more influence, more willingness to destroy innocent lives. Will his testimony be enough? She'd asked Cale. Combined with the apothecary's records and the sealed receipt? Yes. Cale's expression had been satisfied. We have a direct line from Darian to the purchase of poison, to its administration, to Rowan's death. That's more than enough for a formal trial. The Grand Council had moved with surprising speed once the evidence had been presented. Within a week, they'd assembled a full tribunal to hear charges against Darian Ashford, not just for Rowan's murder, but for a litany of crimes revealed by the investigation. Fraud, intimidation, conspiracy to commit murder, bribery of council officials, and a dozen other charges that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning years. The trial had been held in the Grand Council chambers, and this time, Lysandra had been there as a witness rather than the accused. The chamber had been packed. Council members, nobles, wealthy merchants, all the people who'd once condemned her now gathered to watch Darian face justice. Lysandra had sat in the witness section, flanked by Kyle on one side and Alara on the other, and tried to keep her hands from shaking. Darian had entered in chains, actual iron chains, just like the ones they'd put on Lysandra months ago. But unlike her, he'd walked with his head held high, his expression one of contempt rather than fear. This is a farce, he'd declared before anyone had even spoken. A political persecution orchestrated by a king who wants to expand his influence, and a convicted murderer who's manipulated you all with lies. You'll have your chance to defend yourself, the head councilman had replied coldly. But first, you'll listen to the charges. The formal reading had taken an hour. With each charge, Lysandra had watched Darian's mask of composure crack a little more. He'd been prepared to defend against murder accusations, but the investigation had uncovered so much more. Decades of carefully hidden crimes, buried bodies both literal and metaphorical, a network of corruption that had touched nearly every aspect of kingdom commerce. When they'd gotten to the murder charge specifically, the prosecutor had called Marcus Grayson to testify. The steward had looked like he'd aged 10 years in the week since his arrest. His voice had shaken as he'd repeated his confession, how Darian had approached him, threatened his family, paid him to poison Rowan slowly over weeks. And after Lord Rowan died, the prosecutor had asked, Darian came to me, said I'd done well, that my daughter was safe as long as I kept quiet. Then he asked me to plant evidence in Lady Lysandra's room, a vial of the same poison I'd used. Marcus had looked at Lysandra for the first time, his eyes pleading. I'm sorry, my lady. I was afraid. I thought if I refused, my daughter would— Your daughter is safe now, Lysandra had said, her voice carrying across the chamber. Darian can't hurt her anymore. Thank you for telling the truth. Marcus had broken down weeping. Next, they'd called Henrik the apothecary, who'd presented his records and the sealed receipt. The seal had been examined by experts and confirmed as authentic. Darian's personal mark, impossible to forge. This receipt proves you authorized the purchase of the poison that killed Lord Rowan Vale, the prosecutor had stated. How do you explain that? I don't recall signing any such document, Darian had replied smoothly. My seal has been used without my knowledge before. Perhaps the steward forged it. That seal requires a specific key kept on your person at all times. Are you claiming the steward somehow stole your key, made an impression, returned it without your knowledge, and then used the forgery to authorize a purchase, all while keeping the original receipt for months just in case someone investigated? Darian's jaw had tightened. Stranger things have happened. Indeed they have, such as a man murdering his best friend to steal trade routes worth millions in gold. The trial had continued for 3 more days. Witness after witness had testified. Merchants Darian had ruined, servants who'd overheard incriminating conversations, even 2 council members who'd been bribed and now sought leniency through cooperation. But the moment Lysandra had been waiting for had come on the final day, when she'd been called to give her testimony. She'd stood before the tribunal, acutely aware that these were the same people who'd convicted her months ago. Some had looked ashamed. Others had maintained their expressions of careful neutrality. But all of them had listened as she'd told her story one final time. She'd spoken about her marriage to Rowan, the love they'd shared, the life they'd been building, the plans they'd made. She'd described waking to find him dying, the terror and helplessness, the desperate need to understand what had happened. And then she'd talked about Darian's betrayal, how he'd twisted her grief into guilt, manufactured evidence, controlled the narrative so completely that she'd had no chance at a fair hearing. I loved my husband, she'd said, her voice breaking. I would have given anything to save him. Instead, I was branded a murderer and thrown into the wilderness to die. I survived by instinct, by stubbornness, by refusing to let Darian Ashford's lies be the last word on my life. She'd looked directly at Darian. You took everything from me. My husband, my home, my name. But you couldn't take my truth. And now everyone knows what you are. Darian had sneered. A touching performance, but it doesn't change the fact that you were convicted by this very council. Are you all going to admit you were wrong? That you condemned an innocent woman based on lies? The chamber had gone silent. This was the question at the heart of everything. Could the council admit their mistake without destroying their own credibility? The head councilman had stood, his expression grave. The council's verdict was based on evidence presented at the time, he'd said carefully. Evidence we now know was fabricated, and testimony we now know was coerced or bought. We did not knowingly convict an innocent woman. We were deceived by someone who manipulated our justice system for personal gain. He turned to look at Darian. That deception ends today. The final verdict had been delivered the next morning. The tribunal had found Darian Ashford guilty on 17 counts, including murder, conspiracy, fraud, and bribery. The evidence had been overwhelming, the testimony too consistent to dismiss, the pattern too clear to ignore. The sentence had been death. Lysandra had felt a complicated rush of emotions as the head councilman had read the verdict. Justice, yes. Relief, absolutely. But also something hollow, because Rowan was still dead and no verdict could bring him back. Darian had stood to receive his sentence with the same contempt he'd shown throughout the trial. But when the councilman had asked if he had any final words, something in his mask had finally cracked. He'd looked at Lysandra with eyes full of poison and fury. You think you've won, he'd said, his voice low and venomous. You think justice has been served, but all you've done is prove that truth is just another weapon, one wielded by whoever tells the most convincing story. I told my story first, and it destroyed you. You told yours louder, and it destroyed me. But neither changes what we really are. 2 people fighting over a dead man's legacy. He'd paused. I did love Rowan in my way, but he was weak. And weakness is a liability in this world. I eliminated a liability. You can call it murder. I call it survival. Then we have very different definitions of survival, Lysandra had replied. Because I survived by holding on to truth and compassion, even when the whole world said I was wrong. You survived by killing and manipulating and destroying anyone in your path. And look where it brought us. I'm standing free, vindicated, alive. You're in chains awaiting execution. Which one of us really survived? Darian had had no answer for that. But the council had had one final matter to address. The head councilman had turned to Lysandra, his expression one of formal solemnity. Lady Lysandra Vale, this council acknowledges that a grave injustice was done to you. Your conviction is hereby vacated, your sentence nullified, and your name cleared of all charges. The brand you bear is recognized as a mark of injustice rather than guilt, and you are restored to full legal status within the kingdom. The words had been formal, legal, but they'd hit Lysandra like a physical force, vindicated, cleared, restored. Furthermore, the councilman had continued, the estates and properties seized from you upon conviction are hereby returned, along with compensation for your suffering and the months of exile you endured wrongfully. Lysandra had stood there, trying to process what was happening. She was getting everything back, her title, her lands, her freedom. Everything Darian had stolen. But the councilman hadn't finished. This council also extends its formal apology for failing to see through the deception perpetrated against you. We recognize that our systems were exploited, and we commit to reforms that will prevent such manipulation in the future. You have shown remarkable courage in pursuing truth against overwhelming odds, and the kingdom is better for it. An apology. From the body that had condemned her, Lysandra had never expected that. She'd looked at the assembled council members, at the nobles and merchants filling the chamber, at Kael and Alara sitting in the observer section with proud smiles. I accept your apology, she'd said quietly, but I want more than words. I want the reforms you promised. I want systems that protect the powerless instead of exploiting them. I want a kingdom where someone like me doesn't need a king's protection to find justice. She'd paused. That's what Rowan would have wanted. That's the legacy I want to build in his name. The chamber had erupted in applause, genuine, sustained, acknowledging not just her vindication, but her vision. Darian's execution had been scheduled for a week later, giving him time to settle his affairs. Lysandra had visited him once in that final week, in the cell where he awaited his fate. He'd looked diminished somehow, the fine clothes replaced by prisoner's garb, the arrogance tempered by the proximity of death. But his eyes had still held that cold intelligence. Come to gloat? He'd asked when she'd entered. No, I came to ask why. Lysandra had sat across from him, a table and guards between them. You had wealth, position, respect. Rowan was your friend. Why kill him? Darian had been quiet for a long moment. Then he'd laughed, a sound without humor. Because he was going to ruin everything our families built. The trade monopolies, the controlled markets, the system that kept power where it belonged, with people who understood how to use it. Rowan wanted to open everything up, let common merchants compete, break the old family's control. He'd shaken his head. He called it fairness. I called it chaos. Someone had to stop him. So you poisoned him, framed me, destroyed lives. I did what was necessary, and I'd do it again. Darian had leaned forward. The difference between us, Lysandra, is that I was never conflicted about what I wanted. Power, control, dominance. I pursued them without hesitation. You wanted to believe in fairness and justice and love conquering all. And where did it get you? Months in the wilderness, nearly dead, branded a murderer. If not for extraordinary luck, meeting the king's mother, gaining his protection, you'd have died forgotten. Maybe, but I survived, and you didn't. I survived for years, decades. I built an empire. Darian's smile had been bitter. You survived one winter in the woods. We're not the same. You're right. We're not. Lysandra had stood, because when I die, years from now, peacefully in my sleep, people will remember me as someone who fought for truth. You'll be remembered as a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition consumes everything human. She'd moved toward the door, then paused. Goodbye, Darian. I hope you find peace in whatever comes next. I doubt I will. His voice had followed her. But neither will you. Rowan's still dead. That doesn't change, no matter how many people call you innocent. He'd been right about that. Justice didn't resurrect the dead. But as Lysandra had walked out of that prison into the sunlight, she'd realized something important. She could honor Rowan's memory by living fully, by building the fair and just world he'd wanted to create. That was resurrection of a different kind. The day of Darian's execution, Lysandra had stood in the crowd gathered to witness justice being served. Not out of bloodlust, but as a witness to the end of a chapter. Darian had walked to the scaffold with his head high, refusing a hood, wanting to face death directly. At the last moment, he'd looked out at the crowd and found Lysandra's eyes. They'd stared at each other for a long moment. Two people whose lives had been irreversibly entangled by murder and lies and the long pursuit of truth. Then the executioner's blade had fallen, and Darian Ashford was gone. Lysandra had felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief, not triumph. Just a quiet sense of closure. The man who'd destroyed her life had faced consequences for his actions. The system that had failed her had been forced to acknowledge its mistakes. It was enough. In the weeks that followed, Lysandra had returned to Vale Manor for the first time since her exile. The house had been both familiar and strange, filled with memories of Rowan but also haunted by everything that had happened there. She'd walked through rooms where she and Rowan had laughed and loved and built their life together. She'd stood in the chamber where he died, letting herself grieve fully for the first time since that terrible morning. And then she'd begun the work of transformation. The manor became a school, a place where young people without wealth or connections could learn trades, study law, gain the education and skills needed to build better lives. Lysandra had funded it with the compensation from the council and the profits from her estates, which she'd restructured to operate more fairly than before. "You're giving away your fortune," Elara had observed during one of her visits. "I'm investing it in something more valuable than gold," Lysandra had replied. "I'm investing in people who remind me of myself, smart, capable, but lacking the advantages that birth and wealth provide. If I can help even a few of them avoid the powerlessness I felt, it's worth every coin." Kael had visited often as well, helping Lysandra navigate the politics of running estates and managing the school. Their friendship had deepened into something more over those months, a connection built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the understanding that came from facing darkness together. One evening, as they'd walked through the manor gardens where Lysandra had once been accused of meeting a fictional lover, Kael had stopped by the fountain and turned to her. "I have a proposition," he'd said, his usual confidence tinged with something that looked almost like nervousness. "I'm listening." The Northern Territories need leadership, strong, fair, committed to justice over profit. I've been managing them alone, but I could do better with a partner. Someone who understands both nobility and suffering, who's proven they can survive impossible odds and emerge stronger. Lysandra's heart had begun to race. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking you to stand beside me, not as a subject or even an ally, but as an equal, as my queen." Kael had taken her hands. "I'm asking you to marry me, to help me build the kind of kingdom Rowan would have wanted, fair, just, where truth matters more than power." She'd stared at him, this man who'd given her back her life, who'd fought beside her for justice, who'd seen her at her lowest and still believed she was worthy of standing beside a king. "I loved Rowan," she'd said quietly. "I'll always love him. That doesn't change." "I know. I'm not asking you to forget him or replace him. I'm asking you to honor his memory by building something beautiful from the ashes of what was destroyed." Kael's grip had tightened on her hands. "I'm asking you to choose life and partnership and the future over grief and isolation and the past." Lysandra had thought about the girl she'd been, the sheltered noblewoman who'd believed the system would protect her, who'd trusted that truth and justice were synonymous, who'd never imagined she could survive alone. That girl was dead. She died in the wilderness, frozen and starving and afraid. But from those ashes, something new had emerged. Someone stronger, wiser, unbreakable. Someone who'd faced death and injustice and exile and come back to demand the world acknowledge her truth. Someone who deserved a future. "Yes," she'd said, "I'll marry you. I'll stand beside you, and together we'll build something worth the price we paid to get here." The wedding had been held 6 months later, in the spring when the frontier woods where Lysandra had nearly died burst into bloom with new life. They'd married not in a grand cathedral, but in the open air, surrounded by the people who'd fought beside them, merchants who'd testified against Darian, servants who'd risked their jobs to speak truth, common folk who'd demanded justice when the powerful tried to silence them. Elara had stood as witness, tears streaming down her face as she'd watched her son pledge his life to the woman she'd met dying in a ravine. "You're making me a queen," Lysandra had said to Kael the night before the ceremony. "A woman who was branded a murderer is going to wear a crown." "Not despite the brand," Kael had corrected. "Because of it." Because you wore that mark of injustice and refused to let it define you. Because you turned shame into armor and used it to fight for truth. He touched her shoulder where the brand still marked her skin. This is part of your story. It's proof of where you've been, what you've survived. You don't have to hide it anymore. And so, at the wedding, Lysandra had worn a dress that left her shoulder bare, the brand visible to everyone who watched. No more hiding, no more shame, just truth, raw and undeniable. When Kael had placed the crown on her head, a simple circlet of silver and sapphires, and called her queen, Lysandra had felt the weight of it. Not the physical weight, but the responsibility. The commitment to be worthy of what Rowan had believed in, what the people who'd fought beside her had sacrificed for. She'd turned to face the assembled crowd, hundreds of people, rich and poor, noble and common, all gathered to witness this impossible moment, and spoke. I stand before you as proof that the powerless can become powerful through truth and determination, that the condemned can find vindication through courage and refusing to stay silent, that a woman left to die in the wilderness can return to claim not just her name, but a kingdom. She'd paused, letting the words settle. I'm not your queen because of birth or wealth or divine right. I'm your queen because I survived, because I fought, because I refused to let injustice have the final word. And as your queen, I promise to fight for every person who's ever been cast aside, branded, condemned without fair hearing. The wilderness doesn't claim everyone it touches. Some of us come back stronger, and we build kingdoms where the lost can find their way home. The cheers that followed had shaken the trees, carried on wind that smelled of pine and possibility. That night, alone in their chambers, Kael had found Lysandra standing at the window, looking out at the mountains that marked the frontier. Thinking about the wilderness, he'd asked. Thinking about the woman who walked into those trees expecting to die, Lysandra had replied. Wondering what she'd think if she could see this moment. I think she'd be proud. I think she'd recognize that everything she endured had purpose. Kael had joined her at the window. You know, they're calling you the resurrected queen, the woman who died and came back. I like that, Lysandra had smiled. It's true in a way. The old Lysandra did die in that wilderness, but something new was born there, something that couldn't be broken by exile or starvation or injustice. And what happens to this new Lysandra now that the fight is over? The fight's never over. She'd turned to look at him. But the nature of it changes. Now, instead of fighting for survival, I fight to build something worth surviving for. A kingdom where justice is real, where power doesn't corrupt, where people like Thomas and Marcus aren't forced to choose between their conscience and their families. That's ambitious. I survived 3 months alone in the frontier woods. Ambition is the least of what I'm capable of. Lysandra had taken his hand. Besides, I'm not doing it alone anymore. They'd stood together at that window as the sun set over the mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and fire. Somewhere in those distant trees, a woman had once huddled against the cold, broken and alone, certain she'd been forgotten by the world. But the world had been wrong to forget her. And she'd returned to remind them all that truth, however buried, always finds its way back to light. Years later, when people told the story of Lysandra Vale, they spoke of the resurrected queen who'd been cast into darkness and emerged to reshape an entire kingdom. They told children her tale as proof that justice, though delayed, could still be achieved. They pointed to the schools she'd founded, the fair trade routes she'd opened, the legal reforms she'd championed that made the system harder to manipulate. But Lysandra's favorite part of the story was always the middle, the part where a desperate, branded woman had pulled a stranger from a flooding ravine in the middle of a thunderstorm, with no expectation of reward, simply because it was right. Because that moment, more than any crown or title or vindication, proved what she'd always known in her heart. She wasn't a murderer. She was a survivor. And survivors didn't just endure, they transformed the very world that tried to break them.